Hey friend, welcome back. If you are brand new here, welcome home. And if you have been here before, I'm genuinely glad you came back tonight. So here is something I want you to think about for just 1 second. Right now, in this moment, you are lying down, maybe in bed, maybe on the couch. You are comfortable. The lights are probably dim, and very soon you're going to close your eyes and drift off. But before you do, let me ask you something strange. What if the way you are positioned right now was once considered the height of luxury? What if the simple act of sharing a meal, just sitting around food with other people, was not something humans always did? What if there was a time deep in our past when the dinner table did not exist, when there were no plates, no spoons, no candles, no conversation? And what if the moment all of that changed, the single spark that turned eating from survival into something deeply human happened? Not in a palace, not in a royal kitchen, but around a small fire, in the dark, 1,000,000 years before any of us were born. Tonight we're going back to the very beginning, not to ancient Rome, not to medieval England, not even to the first civilization. We're going back further than that, to the first dinner. But before we begin this journey together, if this kind of storytelling is something you enjoy, something that helps your mind slow down and drift into something beautiful, it would mean the world to me if you took 2 seconds to hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. And if you feel moved to leave a comment, maybe just where in the world you are watching this from tonight, or what time it is where you are, I would genuinely love to read every single one of them. Your words are what keeps this little corner of the internet alive. Now get comfortable, adjust your pillow, turn down the lights just a little more, maybe turn on a soft fan in the background if you have one, and let's begin. Here is something that will quietly rearrange the way you think about dinner tonight. Approximately 1.8 million years ago, a creature walked across the African landscape. Not quite an ape. Not quite what we would call human, but close, remarkably close. His name, the name scientists gave him much later, was Homo erectus, which simply means upright man. And if you could somehow stand beside him on that ancient hillside, the first thing you would notice is not how different he looks. It is how familiar he feels. He walks on 2 legs the same as you. He carries things in his hands the same as you. His eyes are alert, curious, searching. But there is one thing Homo erectus did, one behavior, one tiny little shift that Harvard anthropologist Richard Wrangham has spent decades arguing was the most important thing any human being has ever done. He cooked his food, not just ate it raw, not just grabbed it and ran. He brought it to a fire. He sat down, and he shared it. Now I know what you might be thinking. Great, he barbecued something. Why does that matter? Oh friend, this is where it gets extraordinary. Before cooking, eating was a full-time job. Chimpanzees, our closest living relatives, spend somewhere between 6 and 8 hours a day just chewing. 6 to 8 hours, every single day. Imagine spending 1/3 of your waking life with your jaw moving. No conversations, no stories, no connection. Just raw, fibrous plants and tough, uncooked meat slowly, laboriously broken down by powerful jaws and a long working gut. Our earliest ancestors were not that different. But here is what fire changed, and this is the part that still gives scientists genuine chills. Cooking breaks down the tough cellular walls of food before it ever enters your body. It pre-digests it in a way, which means your body suddenly needs far less energy to process a meal. Which means all that extra energy that used to go to your gut, your jaw muscles, your digestive system suddenly had nowhere else to go, except up to your brain. Wrangham's landmark 2009 book, Catching Fire, How cooking made us human lays it out with quiet, devastating clarity. Around 1.8 million years ago, something remarkable happened in the fossil record. Homo erectus shows up with a dramatically larger brain than his predecessors, but also, and this is the key with smaller teeth, weaker jaw muscles, a shorter, more compact digestive tract. These are not the features of a creature eating raw food. These are the features of a creature eating cooked food. The cooking hypothesis, as it is known, suggests that fire did not just warm us. Fire made us. But here is where the story becomes something more than biology. Because the most profound thing that happened around that ancient fire was not physical. It was social. Think about what a fire does at night. It creates a circle, a warm, glowing circle of light in the dark, with the unknown and the dangerous lurking just beyond its edges. And inside that circle, safety, warmth, a reason to stay close together. Archaeologist Polly Wiesner of the University of Utah published a fascinating study in 2014 looking at how modern hunter-gatherer communities, the Yuhuansi people of southern Africa, actually use their time around fire. What she found was striking. During the day, conversations around the community were practical, about food, about work, about tasks that needed doing. But at night, around the fire, the content of conversations shifted completely. At night, people told stories. They talked about people who were not there. They discussed ideas. They laughed. They gossiped. They imagined things that had not happened yet. They kept the memories of people who had died alive through words alone. Wiesner estimated that nighttime firelight conversations were the birthplace of what we now call storytelling, that fundamental human urge to sit together in the dark and say, "Let me tell you something," which means that in a very real, very beautiful sense, you and I are not doing anything new tonight. We are doing something ancient. Now, one thing I want to be honest about, because I think you deserve the honesty, is that the exact timeline of cooking is genuinely debated among scientists. The earliest unambiguous physical evidence of controlled fire comes from places like Wonderwork Cave in South Africa, where ash and charred bone have been dated to roughly 1 million years ago, and from Qasem Cave in Israel, where a remarkable hearth was found that dates to somewhere between 300,000 and 400,000 years ago. But Wrangham's biological argument that the body changes in Homo erectus are simply incompatible with a raw food diet pushes the origin of cooking back even further. Maybe 1.8 million years, maybe further still. We do not know with certainty. And I find that honest uncertainty strangely beautiful. It means the story is still open, still being written. Scientists are still digging, still arguing, still finding new pieces of that ancient puzzle. But here is what we do know. At some point, whether it was 1 million years ago or closer to 2, something shifted. Someone somewhere did not just eat near a fire. They placed something into a fire deliberately and waited. And when they took it out and tasted it, something in them recognized that this was better, softer, richer, safer, more nourishing. And then, and this is the part that matters most, they did not eat it alone. They brought it back. They shared it. That act, the act of bringing food back to share with others, is, according to many anthropologists, one of the defining behaviors that separates us from every other species on Earth. Chimpanzees share food occasionally under social pressure, but regular, deliberate food sharing around a central location, that is us. That is uniquely human. And the hearth, that warm circle of fire and shared food, became the first home, the first kitchen, the first dining room, the first gathering place of the species that would eventually build cathedrals and compose symphonies and send machines to other planets. It all started at a fire in the dark, with someone choosing to sit down next to another person and say, "Here, take some of this." Now I want to close this part of our journey tonight with something that I find quietly moving. Every ritual we now associate with dining, the gathering, the preparation, the sitting together, the conversation, the candles on a table, mimicking the glow of fire, all of it has a direct unbroken line back to those ancient circles of warmth. The next time you sit down to a meal with someone you love, and I mean really sit down, phones away, no rush, you are participating in something that is not just a meal. You are doing something that your ancestors did 1,000,000 years before you. You are gathering around the fire. You are choosing to be close. You're doing the most human thing there is. And the fact that we are slowly losing that eating alone, eating fast, eating in front of screens, might just be one of the quietest losses of our time. But that is a thought for later in our journey. Because right now, there is so much more to discover. Because if the first dining habit of humanity was gathering together, then the second great question of history becomes what happened when we got wealthy enough to make a show of it. What happened when food stopped being about survival and started being about power? And the answer, the absolutely extraordinary, slightly baffling and honestly kind of hilarious answer, takes us all the way to the dining rooms of ancient Rome, where the richest, most sophisticated people on earth decided that the proper way to eat dinner was lying down. So you made it to part 2, which tells me something about you. You're not the kind of person who falls asleep easily, or maybe you are and you just wanted a little more of this first. Either way, I am glad you're still here. Now, before we go further, I want to ask you something genuinely curious. If someone told you that the most powerful, most sophisticated, most culturally refined people on earth, people who built aqueducts, wrote philosophy, invented concrete, and ran an empire stretching from Scotland to Syria, if someone told you that these people ate dinner lying flat on their sides, propped up on one elbow for hours at a time, would you believe them? Because it is completely true. And once I tell you the full story, not just the what, but the why and the who sat where and what it all meant beneath the surface, you will never look at a fancy dinner party the same way again. Let us talk about ancient Rome. And I do not mean the Rome of gladiators and conquest. That version of Rome gets all the attention. I mean the quieter, stranger, more intimate Rome. The Rome that happened behind closed doors in the evenings, when the day's business was finished and the wealthy classes retreated into their homes and did something that by modern standards looks absolutely bizarre. They called the room the triclinium. The word itself comes from Greek tri, meaning 3, and klein, meaning couch or bed. 3 couches. That is what a Roman dining room was built around. Picture it like this. You walk through the front door of a wealthy Roman home, maybe somewhere in the city of Rome itself, maybe in one of the gleaming houses we have found preserved under volcanic ash in Pompeii. You are led through the atrium, past the central pool of rainwater, past the painted walls, and the little household shrine where the family's gods reside. And then you step into the triclinium. The room is dimly lit by oil lamps, dozens of them arranged on stands, casting warm, moving light across painted walls. The colours are extraordinary. Deep reds, brilliant yellows, scenes from mythology garden views designed to make the room feel larger than it is. The floor is often mosaic, sometimes simple geometric patterns, sometimes elaborate scenes of fish and birds and theatrical masks. And in the centre, arranged in a shallow U-shape, 3 wide low couches. Reclining surfaces really each angled slightly away from the central table, each comfortably wide enough for 3 adults to stretch out side by side, propped up on their left elbows, their legs extending behind them. Up to 9 guests. No more than 9 traditionally, the Romans had a saying about it. Septem convivium novem vero convitium. 7 makes a dinner party, 9 makes a brawl. They were very precise people. Now I want you to stop for a moment and actually imagine reclining like this. Left elbow on a cushion, body stretched out, right hand free to reach toward the table. You're probably thinking that sounds incredibly uncomfortable for eating. And honestly, you are not wrong. It takes practice. It takes the right clothing, loose tunics, not anything structured, and it takes a certain willingness to simply slow down, which is perhaps exactly the point. Because here is something that most people miss when they first encounter the Roman triclinium. The reclining position was not about comfort in the way we think of comfort today. It was not about being physically relaxed in the way you are right now. It was a statement. To recline while eating was to announce with your entire body that you were a person of leisure, a person who did not need to rush, a person who had no early morning labour waiting for them, no fields to tend, no trade to open at dawn. Slaves ate standing up or did not eat at the table at all. Children sat on chairs or stools at the side of the table. Women in the earlier periods of Roman history sat at the edge of the couch rather than reclining fully. But a Roman citizen, a man of status, a free man, a man who mattered in the social architecture of Rome, he reclined. His posture was his passport, and I find that detail genuinely fascinating, the way the body itself was used as a language long before a single word was spoken. Today we dress up for dinner. We use certain forks in a certain order. We put our phones away, or we should anyway. But the Romans literally arranged their bodies to communicate something about who they were. The table was not just where they ate, it was where they performed themselves. But the performance went even deeper than that. Because in the Roman triclinium, where you sat, or rather where you lay, was everything. The 3 couches had names. The lectus emus, the low couch, was where the host reclined. The lectus medius, the middle couch, was the position of greatest honour. The guest placed there could speak easily with the host, could see the entrance of the room, could observe the entertainment, and in homes with a garden view could appreciate a carefully designed vista that was arranged specifically to impress important visitors. The lectus summus, the high couch, was for guests of lesser importance. Now, and this is where it gets quietly wonderful, the seating arrangements were not announced. They were understood. A Roman dinner guest was expected to know where he ranked. To walk in and seat yourself in a position above your actual status was considered one of the most embarrassing social errors a person could commit. There are references in Roman literature, in the poet Horace, in the letters of Pliny the Younger, to the delicate social choreography of these dinners. Who entered the room first? Who reclined where? Who was served the better wine, and who quietly received a slightly lower quality vintage that they were expected to accept without comment? Yes. Roman hosts sometimes served different quality wine to different guests at the same table. Pliny the Younger wrote about this practice with barely concealed irritation, describing a host who served elaborate dishes to himself and his most honoured guests, while sending inferior food to everyone else, apparently considering this perfectly normal. Pliny found it crass. He wrote that he made a point of serving the same food and wine to everyone at his own table, regardless of their rank, which tells you something interesting. These things were debated. Even 2,000 years ago, people argued about what good hosting actually looked like, about fairness and generosity and status. The social tensions at the dinner table are genuinely timeless. So what did they actually eat? This is where things get specific, and specific is where history becomes alive. A formal Roman dinner called the cena was divided into 3 distinct acts. It began with the gustatio, the appetizers, oysters if the host could afford them, eggs, almost always eggs in some form, olives, preserved vegetables, small salted fish. The gustatio was designed to open the appetite and stimulate conversation. Light, bright, tangy flavours. Wine was drunk here too, but cautiously mixed generously with water, because the Romans believed that drinking undiluted wine too early in the evening dulled the senses. They had a name for undiluted wine, actually. They called it mirum, and they considered drinking it neat to be a sign of barbarism. A Roman aristocrat mixing his wine with water was not being moderate, he was being civilized. Then came the main course, the cena proper. This was where the host's ambitions and budget went on full display. Multiple dishes brought out simultaneously and arranged on the table for guests to help themselves. Roasted meats pork was enormously popular, more so than beef. Chicken. Fish, especially elaborate preparations of sea fish. Game birds. And always sauces. The Romans were obsessed with a condiment called garum. If you've never heard of it, let me paint you a picture. Garum was a fermented fish sauce made by layering fish, usually anchovies or mackerel, with salt in large ceramic vessels, and leaving them to ferment in the sun for weeks, sometimes months. The liquid that resulted was dark, pungent, intensely savoury. It went on almost everything. Pasta 2,000 years before Italy claimed pasta as its own. Meat, vegetables, eggs, desserts. And here is the thing: food historians who have worked to recreate ancient Roman recipes describe garum as something closer to a complex, deeply savoury fish sauce than to anything we might wrinkle our noses at. It was in essence the ancient world's version of what we now call umami. The fifth taste, that deep, satisfying, mysteriously compelling flavour that makes a dish feel complete. Some food historians argue that garum was one of the most sophisticated condiments ever produced by any civilization, and Rome produced it at industrial scale. There were garum factories along the Spanish coast in North Africa, across the Mediterranean. Amphorae of the stuff were shipped across the entire Roman Empire. A millionaire in Rome and a soldier on Hadrian's Wall in northern Britain were in some small way eating the same flavour. I think that is kind of beautiful. And then the meal ended with the secunda mensa, the dessert course. Fruit always, nuts, honey cakes, preserved figs, sometimes elaborate pastry confections for grander occasions. And with the dessert course the nature of the evening shifted, because now the wine came out properly. A figure called the Rex Bibendi, the king of drinking, was chosen often by the roll of dice. This person decided how much water to mix with the wine for the rest of the evening, essentially controlling the pace and intensity of what followed. And what followed was often extraordinary, because the Roman dinner party was not just a meal. It was an event. Poets recited, musicians played, acrobats performed between the couches, philosophers debated, dancers moved through the lamplight, and the host, if he was truly ambitious, might produce what the Romans called a subtlety, an elaborate decorative surprise. A whole roasted peacock, its feathers carefully replaced after cooking so that the bird appeared momentarily to still be alive. A pastry construction in the shape of a temple. A dish that seemed to be one thing and revealed itself to be something else entirely. The Romans understood something that we've largely lost and are only now slowly beginning to rediscover, that the most memorable meals are theatrical. That food is not just nutrition, it is spectacle, it is art. It is the medium through which a host communicates generosity, creativity, power, and if they do it right, genuine warmth. Now here is where I want to offer you a slightly different angle on all of this, because it is very easy to read about Roman banquets and see only the excess, the wealth, the slaves, the hierarchy, the showing off. And yes, all of that was absolutely there. But if you look more carefully, you find something else underneath it. You find people who were intensely hungry for connection. Roman dinner parties lasted for hours, sometimes well into the night, lit by oil lamps when the daylight faded. These were not rushed affairs. They were long, slow, unhurried evenings in which people talked and debated and laughed and argued and told stories and listened to music and simply existed together. The Roman philosopher Epicurus, whose name we've rather unfairly reduced to mean mere physical pleasure, actually wrote that the most important thing about a meal was not what was on the table, but who was sitting at it. He said something that has stayed with me since I first read it, that before you worry about the food you're going to eat, you should first make sure about the people you're going to eat it with. Not a bad piece of advice for any century. And honestly, thinking about it now, in a world where the average American family shares a sit-down dinner together fewer than 5 times a week, and where a significant portion of meals are eaten alone in front of a screen in under 15 minutes, I wonder sometimes what a Roman host would make of us. I think he would find the food extraordinary. The refrigeration alone would probably break his brain. But the eating, the rushing, the isolation, the distraction, he might quietly think these people have forgotten something important. He might not be entirely wrong. But we are not done yet. Because here is what I have not told you yet about the Roman triclinium. The Romans had a phrase ab ovo usque ad mala, which means from egg to apple, from the first course to the last, from beginning to end. And they used it to describe not just a meal, but a complete experience, a full arc. They understood that a meal was a journey, and journeys by their nature pass through many different landscapes, which brings us to the next great chapter of our story, because after the fall of Rome, after the aqueducts crumbled and the triclinia were buried, and the garum factories went silent, something remarkable happened. The dining habits of the Western world did not simply collapse, they transformed into something wilder, something more superstitious, something ruled not by philosophers and poets, but by harvests and faith, and the raw, relentless mathematics of who had enough to eat and who did not. Medieval Europe was coming, and at the centre of its table, sharp a stranger and more precious than gold, was something so small you could hold it in the palm of your hand, a handful of spices, and the story of what people did to get them is one of the most extraordinary, most human and most quietly devastating chapters in the entire history of food. A handful of spices. That is what started it all. Not a war over land, not a dispute over gold, not a religious crusade, though religion would get tangled up in it eventually, as it always does. At the root of some of the most dramatic voyages, the most audacious gambles, and the most devastating consequences in all of human history, there was a small, dried, wrinkled little thing that you probably have sitting in your kitchen cabinet right now, completely ignored next to the oregano, black pepper. And I want to tell you something that I think genuinely reframes the way we understand the medieval world, because most people, when they think about the Middle Ages and spices, have a very specific idea in their heads. They have heard that medieval people use spices to cover up the taste of rotting meat. Bad preservation, bad food, desperate flavouring to mask what was essentially going bad on the table. I believed this for a long time, actually, and it turns out it is almost certainly not true. Let me explain why that matters, because this is one of those moments where the myth is actually more interesting than the correction. The myth says medieval food was terrible. People were desperate and spices were a practical solution to a disgusting problem. The reality says something far more fascinating. Spices were not a solution to poverty. They were a symbol of extraordinary wealth. Think about it this way. If you were trying to stretch your household budget in medieval Europe, if you were a peasant farmer, a blacksmith, a baker, even a reasonably comfortable merchant, the last thing you would do is add expensive imported spices to food that had already gone bad. Spoiled meat was not improved by nutmeg. Rotten fish was not saved by cinnamon. You either preserved your food properly through salting, smoking, drying, fermentation, or you did not have food at all. The people who were buying spices in large quantities were people who could absolutely afford fresh, perfectly good food. They used spices because spices were in the most literal sense a way of putting wealth on the table where everyone could see it. A dish that smelled of pepper and ginger and cloves announced something to every guest at the table before a single word was spoken. The person who prepared this meal paid an extraordinary amount of money for these ingredients. Spices were status. Spices were power. Spices were in the vocabulary of the medieval dinner table, the equivalent of pulling up in a vehicle that costs more than most people's homes. Now, to truly understand how wild this was, you have to understand where spices came from. Black pepper grew in southwestern India in a region we now call Kerala. Nutmeg and mace came from a tiny cluster of islands in what is now Indonesia, a group of islands so small they barely register on a modern map. Cinnamon came from Sri Lanka. Cloves came from only 5 islands in the Maluku archipelago, the famous Spice Islands, an area so geographically remote that European merchants did not even know for centuries exactly where it was. They just knew it was east, impossibly far east. And between Europe and those eastern islands lay the entire continent of Asia, controlled by a complex web of Arab traders, Persian merchants, Indian middlemen, and eventually the Mongol Empire, all of whom took their cut as the spices moved westward, hand to hand, ship to ship, caravan to caravan across thousands of miles. By the time a small sack of black pepper reached a market in Venice or Bruges or London, it had changed hands perhaps a dozen times. Each pair of hands had added a price, and the final price was staggering. Here is a number that I want you to sit with for a moment. In the year 1400, a 1 pound of mace, the dried outer shell of the nutmeg, cost roughly the equivalent of 3 sheep in English markets. 3 sheep for a pound of spice. Pepper was used on multiple documented occasions as a form of currency. There are records of rent payments, legal fines, and even ransoms being settled in peppercorns. When the Visigoth leader Alaric besieged Rome in 408, among his demands was 3,000 pounds of pepper. Not gold alone. Pepper. Because pepper in that moment was as good as gold. The city of Hamburg in what is now Germany used black pepper to pay taxes as late as the 14th century. And in England, the guild of merchants who traded in spices was called with marvellous directness the Pepperers. They were among the most powerful commercial guilds in medieval London. Their descendants eventually became what we now know as the Grocers' Company, one of the oldest trade guilds still in existence. All of that power, all of that wealth, all of that centuries-long commercial history built on tiny dried berries from a vine growing in the forests of southwestern India. But here is where the story takes a turn that I find almost unbearably human. Because for all that pepper was worth, for all that spices were coveted and hoarded and paid for at extraordinary prices, the medieval European world had absolutely no direct access to the source. They were dependent, completely uncomfortably frustratingly dependent on the Arab trading networks that controlled the overland routes through the Middle East, and on the Italian city-states Venice, above all that had negotiated the exclusive rights to receive those goods at the western end of the supply chain. Venice in particular built an entire civilization on this dependency. The Venetian Republic's wealth in the 13th and 14th centuries was in significant part spice wealth. The magnificent buildings along the Grand Canal, the paintings, the glass, the maritime power, all of it was underwritten by the fact that spices coming from Asia had to pass through Venice to reach the rest of Europe. The Venetians guarded this monopoly with ferocious intensity, and the rest of Europe, particularly the kingdoms of Portugal and Spain, who were geographically distant from the Venetian trading routes, and therefore paying the highest prices with the least advantage, began to ask a question. What if there was another way? What if you could reach the Spice Islands without going through the Middle East at all? What if you sailed south around the bottom of Africa? Or, and this was the idea that a Genoese sailor named Cristoforo Colombo pitched to the Spanish crown in 1492, what if you sailed west? Let me pause here for a moment because I think this connection is one that history classes often skip over too quickly. The discovery of the Americas, one of the most world-altering events in human history, an event that reshaped entire continents and changed the genetic and cultural makeup of the planet was at its origin a spice delivery problem. Columbus was not primarily looking for a new world. He was looking for a shorter route to nutmeg. He was looking for pepper and cloves and cinnamon without having to pay Venice a fortune for the privilege. The New World was in the most ironic sense a navigation error on the way to a spice rack. I do not say this to diminish what was found. The consequences of that encounter for good and for devastating ill are almost beyond comprehension. But I do say it to make the point that spices were not a footnote to medieval and early Renaissance history. They were the engine. They were the reason ships were built, the reason maps were drawn, the reason men left their families and sailed into waters no European had charted, trusting mathematics and ambition, and a desperate hunger not for food, but for the thing that went on top of food. And what about the spices themselves? What did they actually taste like on the medieval table? This is something I find genuinely delightful to think about, because medieval European cooking was nothing like what we imagine old-fashioned food to look like today. A feast at a wealthy medieval household, a lord's table, a bishop's dinner, a prosperous merchant celebration would have been, by modern standards, extraordinarily bold and complex in flavour, and in a way that we're only now slowly coming back around to appreciating. Medieval cooks layered spices with a confidence that feels almost modern. A recipe from the 14th century English cookbook known as the Form of Cury, compiled by the master cooks of King Richard II, includes a dish called blancmange that bears almost no resemblance to the pale, wobbly dessert we associate with that name today. The medieval version was a savoury preparation of shredded chicken rice, almond milk, sugar and spices including ginger and sometimes rosewater, a combination of sweet, savoury, fragrant and rich that sounds honestly like something a creative chef in a good restaurant might serve you right now. Medieval cooks also had an extraordinary fondness for colour. They used saffron to turn dishes brilliant gold. They used sandalwood to achieve red. They combined spices not just for taste but for visual impact, because at a great feast the appearance of the food was as important as its flavour. A dish that arrived at the table looking spectacular told the assembled guests in the clearest possible terms that the host had access to ingredients that most of the world could only dream about. In many ways, the medieval spice-laden table was the ancestor of what we now call fine dining food, as experience food, as theatre food, as social communication. The tools were different, the specific flavours were different, but the impulse was exactly the same. Now, I mentioned earlier that the myth about spices hiding bad meat is almost certainly wrong, and I want to honour that almost because history is rarely completely clean. There were absolutely situations, particularly in summer months, and in households without good access to salting or smoking, where food preservation was difficult, and spices might have been used to make something marginally more palatable. But the key insight, the one that changes the whole picture, is that in those cases the people using spices were not the wealthy. The wealthy had preservation. They had ice in some cases packed in underground cellars. They had salt in abundance. They had the resources to buy fresh food regularly. The people who most struggled with food preservation were the people who could least afford spices, which means the historical record, we have the recipe books, the feast accounts, the household ledgers, all of which come from wealthy households, because those are the households that produced written records, show us spices being used not to disguise but to celebrate. History, as always, was written by the people who could afford the pepper. Here is a question I genuinely want to leave with you for a moment. Think about the thing in your life right now that you spend a disproportionate amount of money on. The coffee from the particular place when there is a perfectly acceptable option for a fraction of the price. The specific bottle of wine you bring to a dinner party. The restaurant where the portions are small but the experience is somehow worth every dollar. We still do this. All of us do this. We still take something ordinary, the act of eating, the act of tasting, and load it with meaning. We make it into a signal. We use it to say something about who we are, what we value, who we want to be seen as. The medieval lord piling saffron and ginger onto his feast table was doing exactly the same thing. The impulse is ancient. The ingredient just changes with the century. And speaking of ingredients that changed everything, there is one more twist in the spice story that I have been saving, because it connects the medieval obsession with flavour directly to the next great transformation of the dinner table. Because all of this spice wealth, all of this theatrical cooking, all of this elaborate display, it was happening in a world that still ate with its hands. A world that wiped those spice-covered fingers on shared tablecloths, on bread, on their own clothing. A world where the idea of placing a small metal implement between your food and your mouth would have seemed to many people not just unnecessary, but actively offensive to God. And then one woman arrived in France and brought a fork with her, and the entire social architecture of the European dinner table began slowly to shift. Let me take a moment to think about something before we go further. You have a fork in your hand right now, or at least there is one somewhere nearby, on a table, in a drawer, in a dish rack by the sink, and you have probably never once stopped to wonder how it got there, why it exists, why we all agreed at some point that this particular little metal tool was the civilized way to move food from a plate to a mouth. Because here is the thing. For the vast majority of human history, including the entire Roman Empire we just visited, including the centuries of spice-obsessed medieval feasts, we just walk through the fork as a personal eating utensil, simply did not exist at European tables. People use knives, they use spoons for liquid things, and for everything else they use their fingers, and not just peasants, not just common folk who did not know better. Kings, emperors, popes, the most powerful, most educated, most refined human beings on the planet. All of them reached into shared dishes with their bare hands, picked up their meat, tore their bread, and wiped their fingers on the tablecloth on pieces of bread, or, if they were feeling particularly elegant, on the sleeve of a servant standing nearby for exactly that purpose. This was not considered rude. This was just dinner, so what changed? The answer begins in Florence, Italy, in the year 1519, and it begins with a little girl who had just lost everything. Her name was Caterina Maria Romola di Lorenzo de' Medici. She was born into the most powerful banking family in Renaissance Europe, the Medici, the family whose money had funded Michelangelo, whose influence had shaped the papacy, whose name was synonymous with the entire flowering of the Italian Renaissance. And by the time she was 8 years old, both of her parents were dead. Her father, Lorenzo II, had died of illness. Her mother, Madeleine de la Tour d'Auvergne, had followed just days later. An orphaned Medici girl in a city increasingly hostile to her family, Catherine was placed under the protection of her uncle Pope Clement VII, and raised in convents and palaces across Florence and Rome. She grew up surrounded by the absolute pinnacle of Renaissance culture. The food at Medici tables was extraordinary. The presentation, the ceremony, the attention to detail Florence in the early 16th century was producing some of the most sophisticated culinary culture in the Western world. And at the centre of that culture, quietly but unmistakably, was the fork. Not as a new invention, forks had existed in various forms for centuries, used primarily for serving, for carving, for lifting meats from cooking fires. But in Renaissance Florence, among the wealthy elite, the personal fork, a small, elegant, two-tined instrument placed at each person's setting, was becoming fashionable. Catherine grew up using one. She did not think of it as unusual. It was simply how one ate. Then, in 1533, something extraordinary happened. Catherine de' Medici, she was 14 years old, was betrothed to Henry of Valois, the second son of King Francis I of France. And so she packed her things. Her trousseau included, by various historical accounts, the finest examples of Italian craftsmanship: silk, jewels, perfumes, recipes, and the cooks and pastry chefs who knew how to execute them. She brought with her a retinue of Florentine staff, Florentine flavours, and Florentine table customs, including quietly tucked among the silverware forks. Now, I want to be careful here because this story has been told with varying degrees of accuracy over the centuries, and the romantic version Catherine arrives in France, produces a fork and single-handedly civilises. The French table is a bit of an oversimplification. French nobility already had some awareness of forks. They were not completely unknown, but their use as a personal individual eating implement at every place, setting as a normal expected part of how a refined person ate, this was not yet established in France, and the French court's reaction was not exactly warm. There are accounts, some more reliable than others, of French courtiers finding the whole fork business deeply strange. The implement seemed unnecessary, fussy, excessively Italian. There was a certain pride among the French nobility of that era in the directness of eating with one's hands. It was considered natural, honest, even masculine. But Catherine was not deterred. She was by all accounts a formidably determined woman. She had survived an extraordinary difficult childhood at one point during the Medici family's political troubles. There were actual discussions among her enemies about using her as a hostage, placing her on the walls of Florence during a siege as a warning. She had navigated the treacherous waters of the French court as a foreign-born queen, with no natural allies, watching her husband fall deeply in love with another woman, Diane de Poitiers, who would dominate Henry for his entire life, and simply enduring it, playing the long game with quiet, steely patience. A few sceptical courtiers with opinions about forks were not going to stop her. Over the years of her influence at the French court as Duchess, as Queen, and eventually as Queen Mother after Henry's death in 1559, when she became arguably the most powerful person in France, Catherine used the table as one of her primary instruments of cultural influence. She introduced not just the fork, but a broader philosophy of refined dining that would eventually reshape the entire Western world's relationship with food. Here is what I find genuinely fascinating about Catherine's specific contribution beyond the fork itself. She understood something profound about the psychology of power at the table. The fork, when you think about it carefully, is a deeply civilizing instrument, not because eating with your hands is inherently uncivilized, but because the fork creates distance. It places something between you and your food. It imposes a kind of deliberateness on the act of eating. You have to reach, you have to aim, you have to control your movements with a certain precision. It slows you down. And slowing down at the table, Catherine seemed to understand instinctively, was itself a form of power. A person who eats slowly, who uses implements with practiced ease, who never appears rushed or hungry or desperate, that person communicates something. A kind of unruffled authority, a sense that they are always in control. The fork was not just a utensil, it was a performance of composure, and Catherine, who had spent her entire life performing composure under circumstances that would have broken most people, the orphan girl, the foreign queen, the ignored wife, the patient survivor, understood the power of that performance better than almost anyone. But wait, because I promised you earlier that there was a clergyman who once called fork use an insult to God, and I owe you that story because it is one of my favourite small details in all of food history. It predates Catherine by about 5 centuries. In the year 1004, more than 500 years before Catherine was even born, a Byzantine princess named Maria Argyropoulos travelled from Constantinople to Venice to marry the son of the Venetian doge. She arrived with a golden case containing a set of small golden forks which she used to eat at the table. Venice was scandalized. A theologian named Peter Damian a man apparently very invested in how other people conducted their meals, wrote about her fork use with undisguised horror. He argued that God had given human beings natural forks in the form of their fingers, and that substituting an artificial metal implement was not merely unnecessary, but an act of arrogance toward divine design. God in his wisdom has provided man with natural forks, he reportedly wrote. Therefore it is an insult to him to substitute artificial metal forks for them when eating. When Maria died not long after her arrival in Venice of an illness, as people frequently died in the 11th century, Peter Damian apparently considered this confirmation of his position. Divine judgment delivered via fork. I will let you draw your own conclusions about the theological reasoning there. But what strikes me about this story is not the absurdity of it, though. It is objectively somewhat absurd. What strikes me is how genuinely resistant people were to what now seems like an obvious neutral improvement. Change at the dinner table, it turns out, is surprisingly threatening, because the dinner table is not just a practical space, it is a deeply ritual space. It encodes values, beliefs, hierarchies, identities. When you change how people eat, you're in a very real sense changing who they are. And people do not give that up easily, even when the change is as small as a piece of metal with two tines. Catherine's influence on French and eventually all of Western dining culture extended well beyond the fork, and I want to spend a moment on this because it is genuinely underappreciated. She is credited with varying degrees of historical certainty, with introducing or popularizing a remarkable number of things that we now consider simply normal parts of eating well. The service of multiple distinct courses in a specific sequence: soup, then fish, then meat, then sweets, rather than everything arriving at the table simultaneously, which had been the medieval custom, is often attributed to her Italian influence. The concept of the entremet, small intermediate dishes served between courses both as palate cleansers and as entertainment, became formalized under her influence. Her Florentine pastry chefs are credited with introducing sophisticated pastry techniques to France that would eventually give rise to French patisserie, the croissants, the eclairs, the millefeuille, the pastry tradition that France later claimed so completely as its own that most people have forgotten it arrived from somewhere else, and ice cream. There are claims debated by historians but persistent that Catherine's Florentine retinue brought frozen dessert techniques to France that became the foundation of what we now call gelato and ice cream. Is every one of these attributions historically airtight? Probably not. Catherine has become something of a catch-all figure for the introduction of Renaissance Italian food culture into France, and some of the credit may be more legendary than literal. But the broader truth holds the encounter between Italian Renaissance culinary sophistication and the French court centered around Catherine's long presence. There produced something new. Something that would, over the following 2 centuries, become what we call classical French cuisine, the culinary tradition that defined fine dining for the entire Western world from roughly 1600 onward. The fork was just the beginning. Now here is a question I want to genuinely ask you. Think about something from your own cultural background, a food tradition, a way of eating a specific dish that your family has always made, a certain way that you have never questioned. Something that just is the way it is. How much of it came from somewhere else? How much of what feels native and natural and yours was once at some point an import, a borrowing? Something that arrived the way Catherine's fork arrived, foreign and strange and vaguely threatening, and then over a generation or two simply became the way things were done, I ask. Because food history, more than almost any other kind of history, reveals how porous human culture actually is, how endlessly we borrow and adapt and absorb from each other, how the things that feel most deeply ours are often the things we received most recently from someone else. Catherine de' Medici brought a fork to France. France made it its own. The world eventually followed. And now you and I use a fork every single day without thinking about it once. That is how culture works. Quietly, gradually at the dinner table, one meal at a time. Of course, not everyone's dinner table looked like Catherine's. Not everyone had Florentine silverware and trained pastry chefs and a sequence of elegant courses arriving on fine Venetian glassware. Most people in the 16th century, most people in any century until very recently, ate something that looked nothing like that. Most people ate what they could get, and what most people could get for most of human history was a great deal simpler and a great deal more creative than we tend to imagine. Because the dinner table of the poor has its own extraordinary story, a story of bread that was not just bread, of bowls that were not just bowls, of an entire civilization built on the art of making very little stretch very far, and it starts with a thick slab of yesterday's bread placed flat on the table in front of you, not as a side dish, but as your plate. Picture this for a moment. You sit down at the table. There is no ceramic plate waiting for you. No porcelain, no earthenware, no wooden bowl. Instead, a servant places in front of you a thick, flat, roughly circular slab of bread, dense, dark, a little stale because it was baked 2 or 3 days ago, specifically for this purpose, and you rest it on the table in front of you like a placemat. And then dinner is served directly onto it. The juices from the roasted meat soak into it. The sauce pools in the slight depression that forms as the bread softens. By the end of the meal, this thing that started as your plate has absorbed the entire flavour of everything placed on top of it. And then, depending entirely on who you were and where you sat and what year it was, one of two things happened. If you were wealthy, a servant took it away and gave it to someone poor. If you were poor, you ate it. Either way, nothing was wasted. Welcome to the medieval trencher. The word itself comes from the Old French trenchoir, meaning a cutting board, or more specifically, a thing you cut upon. And for several centuries, roughly from the 12th century through to the 15th, with traces lingering even longer in poorer households, the trencher was simply how the majority of Western Europe served food to people sitting at a table, not as a charming rustic quirk, as the standard. Now, I want to be precise here because history has a way of getting blurry around details like this, and the details are where the story actually lives. There were 2 kinds of trenchers. The first was exactly what I described, a thick round slab of stale bread typically made from a coarser grain like maslin, which was a mixture of wheat and rye baked specifically to be dense and sturdy enough to hold food without collapsing immediately. These bread trenchers were usually several days old before they were used. Fresh bread would have been too soft to function as a plate, and would have dissolved into the meal within minutes. The second type, which emerged a little later and became more common among the wealthier classes, was a wooden board, also called a trencher, that was flat and slightly hollowed in the centre. These were more durable, obviously, and could be washed and reused. They were the transitional object between the bread plate era and the ceramic plate era that would eventually follow. But it is the bread trencher I want to stay with a little longer, because I think it tells us something beautiful and something quietly heartbreaking at the same time. Let me tell you about almsgiving and why it matters here. In medieval Europe, the Catholic Church placed enormous emphasis on the moral obligation of the wealthy to give to the poor. Charity was not optional, it was theological duty. And at great houses, the estates of lords, the halls of bishops, the kitchens of wealthy merchants, the rituals of almsgiving, were woven directly into the structure of daily life. The bread trencher after a meal was called the alms bread. At the end of a feast at a major household, the used bread trenchers soak through with meat dripping, sauce, gravy. The accumulated flavours of every course that had been placed on top of them were collected and given to the poor gathered at the gates. There are records from great English medieval households documenting this practice in careful, almost bureaucratic detail. The household accounts of the Bishop of Winchester from the 13th century, for example, note the daily distribution of leftover trenchers and food to those waiting outside. At major feast days, these distributions could involve hundreds of people. Now I want to sit with this for a moment because it is easy to romanticize it, and it is equally easy to view it cynically, and I think the truth is somewhere more complicated and more human than either. On one hand, this was genuine systematic provision for the hungry. In a world without social safety nets, without food banks, without any of the institutional structures we now rely on, this distribution of alms bread was often the difference between eating and not eating for people living on the margins. It was real. It mattered. The Church's insistence on this obligation, flawed and imperfect as the institution was in so many other ways, created a genuine material flow from the tables of the wealthy into the hands of the poor. On the other hand, you were eating someone else's plate, literally saturated with the remnants of someone else's meal handed to you after it had served its purpose for people who never would have eaten it themselves. I do not say this to condemn the practice. In context, a bread trencher soaked in beef drippings and sauce was genuinely nourishing, far better than nothing. But it captures something about the medieval social order that is worth acknowledging, the way even charity was structured to maintain the distance between who ate first and who ate the leavings. But here is where the story gets richer, because the trencher was only one piece of a broader picture of medieval eating that I think we consistently underestimate. We tend to imagine medieval food as brown, monotonous, porridge-heavy, joyless, and I understand where that image comes from. It emerges partly from the genuine material difficulty of peasant life, and partly from a kind of post-Renaissance condescension toward everything that came before the great cultural flowering of the 15th and 16th centuries. But if you actually dig into the historical record, and I mean really dig into the household accounts and feast records and the cookbooks that have survived, what you find is something far more textured, and in places genuinely surprising. Take bread itself, since we're already there. Medieval bread was not one thing. It was an entire stratified social system expressed in wheat and rye and barley and oats. At the very top of the hierarchy was the manchet, a small fine white bread made from the most expensively milled and bolted flour, nearly as white as what we would recognize as white bread today. This was the bread of kings and nobility. It was soft, slightly, sweet, delicate. Below that was cheat bread, a standard white bread made from flour that had not been quite as finely processed, still predominantly wheat but with more of the bran present. Then came what was called maslin or meslin, that mixed wheat and rye blend I mentioned earlier, which was the bread of the middling classes, and which also made the best trenchers because of its density. Then rye bread, darker and denser, common among rural populations across northern Europe. And at the very bottom, the bread of pure survival, came bread made from barley, from oats, from dried legumes, from chestnuts, in truly desperate times from acorns, in the worst famines from clay mixed with flour to add bulk. The grain in your bread told anyone who looked at your table exactly where you stood in the world, not symbolically, literally. A guest arriving at a table in medieval England could glance at the bread and read the entire social situation of the household in seconds. And this brings me to something that I think is one of the most quietly profound aspects of food history, and one that tends to get lost in the more dramatic stories about feasts and spices and famous queens. For the vast majority of people who have ever lived, not just in the medieval period but across almost all of human history, the central challenge of the dinner table was not what to choose. It was how to make what you had enough. And the solutions people developed, the techniques, the recipes, the customs, represent one of the longest-running examples of human ingenuity in existence. The pottage, for instance. This word gets used loosely to mean medieval stew, but what it actually was is far more interesting than that. Pottage was essentially a catch-all category for anything cooked in a pot with liquid, which meant it was infinitely adaptable to whatever was available. Grain pottage in lean times, vegetable pottage when the garden was producing, meat pottage on feast days, or when a small amount of preserved salt pork could be stretched through a large pot of liquid and root vegetables to feed an entire household. The genius of pottage was not the recipe. There was no single recipe. The genius was the principle, the recognition that liquid extends, that heat transforms, that almost anything becomes more nourishing and more digestible when it has been cooked slowly in water with whatever else is at hand. This principle, stretching small amounts of expensive ingredients through larger amounts of inexpensive ones, is the foundation of virtually every great peasant cuisine in the world. French cassoulet, Italian minestrone, Spanish cocido, American succotash, Irish colcannon. The specific ingredients change by geography and season. The underlying logic is identical, and it was being practiced with quiet daily expertise at medieval tables across Europe, long before any of those regional cuisines had names. Here is a question I want to ask you, and I mean it genuinely. Can you think of a dish, something you make at home, or something your grandmother made, or something from the particular food culture you grew up in, that is essentially the art of making a little go a long way? I am willing to bet almost everyone listening has one, and I am willing to bet that when you eat it there is something about it that feels like more than just food. Something warm and specific and irreplaceable. Something that tastes in a way you cannot quite articulate, like home. That feeling, I believe, is not just personal nostalgia. It is ancestral memory. It is the accumulated wisdom of generations of people who sat at tables with very little and made it beautiful anyway. The peasant woman stirring her pottage over a fire in 13th century England was doing the same essential thing as the Italian grandmother, making minestrone with last week's bread and whatever vegetables were wilting in the garden. Both were doing what human beings have always done at the table, taking what the world provided and making it enough. Now, one more thing about the medieval table that I cannot leave out because it is too strange and too wonderful to pass over. The subtlety. In the great feasts of medieval and early Renaissance Europe, not the peasant meals, but the elaborate banquets of the nobility, there existed a tradition of creating extraordinarily elaborate decorative food sculptures that were placed on the table purely for display and theatrical effect. These were called subtleties, or sometimes entremets in the French tradition, and they were essentially edible art installations. A subtlety might take the form of a castle made entirely of sugar paste, with edible figures standing on its battlements, or a ship in full sail constructed from marzipan crewed by tiny spun sugar sailors, or a heraldic shield bearing a noble family's coat of arms, reproduced in perfect detail in coloured icing and gilded with actual gold leaf. At the coronation feast of King Henry V of England in 1413, the subtleties served between courses depicted scenes from the life of various saints rendered in sugar and marzipan with such detail that they were essentially narrative tableau, edible storytelling placed on the table between the fish course and the meat course. These were not meant to be eaten primarily, they were meant to be admired, to spark conversation, to demonstrate the skill of the household's confectioners and the wealth of the host who could afford such elaborate, time-consuming, ingredient-intensive displays. And then sometimes they were broken apart and eaten anyway. There is something I find completely delightful about that. All that artistry, all that careful construction, and at the end of the evening someone just reached over and broke off a piece and ate the Archbishop's sugar mitre, as you do, thinking about the trencher, that simple, humble slab of stale bread that served as the plate for most people in medieval Europe, and then the subtlety, that breathtaking sugar castle that graced the tables of kings. It strikes me how the same basic culture produced both extremes simultaneously. The same civilization that fed its poor on soaked bread was also gilding marzipan with real gold. The same period that produced bread baked partly from chestnuts and acorns also produced recipe books calling for saffron and ginger and rosewater in dishes that were almost architectural in their complexity. Medieval Europe was not one thing. It was many things at many tables all at the same time, and perhaps that is the most honest and most humbling thing history can tell us about any era, including our own. We're always living inside contradictions we cannot quite see clearly from the inside. But if bread was the foundation of the medieval table, the plate, the filler, the staple, the currency of survival and the language of social rank, then there was something else shaping that table from the outside, something that had nothing to do with economics or agriculture or culinary fashion, something that came from an institution so powerful it could dictate across an entire continent, not just what you believed, but what you were allowed to eat, and on how many days of the year you were allowed to eat it. The church was coming to the dinner table, and it was bringing a list. There is a number I want you to hold in your mind for a moment. 153. That is the approximate number of days per year that the medieval Catholic Church officially designated as fasting days, on which the faithful were prohibited to varying degrees from eating meat, eggs, dairy or animal products of most kinds. 153 days out of 365. That means for nearly half of every single year across an entire continent, for roughly 1,000 years, the church was standing at the door of every kitchen in Europe and saying, "Not today, not that either." And here is what makes this story so extraordinary. It is not a story about deprivation. Well, for some people it was, but for many others, especially the wealthy, it became something far more unexpected. It became an invitation to culinary creativity that produced some of the most ingenious, most elaborate, and most quietly hilarious food innovations in the entire history of cooking. Let me give you the full picture first, because the scale of it is genuinely staggering. In the medieval Catholic calendar, fasting was not a single annual event like Lent, as we might observe it today, a modest reduction in indulgence for 40 days before Easter. It was a continuous calendar-wide system of restriction that wove itself through every week and every season. Every Friday was a fast day. This was in memory of the crucifixion, and it applied to essentially everyone. Every Saturday was often a fast day as well in honor of the Virgin Mary, though this varied by region and era. The entire season of Advent, the 4 weeks before Christmas, was a fasting period. Lent, the 40 days before Easter, was the most intensive fasting period, during which the strictest rule applied. There were ember days, 4 sets of 3 days scattered through the year at the change of seasons designated for prayer and fasting. There were vigils the days before major feast days, which were themselves fast days. Added together, depending on the year, the region, and the specific religious community, you could easily arrive at that figure of 150 or more restricted days annually. On these days, in the strictest interpretation, no meat was permitted. No animal flesh of any warm-blooded creature. But also on the most serious fasting days, particularly in Lent, no eggs, no butter, no milk, no cheese. The logic was theological. Animal products, particularly meat, were associated with the flesh, with warmth, with sensual appetite. Denying them was meant to mortify the body, to quiet its demands, to redirect attention from physical pleasure towards spiritual contemplation. Beautiful in theory. In practice, especially if you were a wealthy nobleman who was accustomed to eating extremely well and had absolutely no interest in genuine deprivation, it created a problem. And where there is a problem and sufficient money, human ingenuity always finds a way. The solutions that medieval and Renaissance cooks developed for fasting days represent, in my view, one of the most underappreciated chapters in culinary history. Start with fish. Fish was permitted on fasting days because fish were cold-blooded, and the medieval understanding of the natural world drawing heavily on ancient Greek philosophy, particularly the writings of Aristotle, classified cold-blooded creatures as fundamentally different in nature from warm-blooded ones. Fish did not arouse the flesh the way meat did. Fish were theologically speaking acceptable, and so fish became the centerpiece of the fasting day table. But not just plain simple fish, not just a piece of grilled herring and an apology for the inconvenience. At wealthy tables, fasting day fish preparations became extraordinarily elaborate. Entire cookbooks were dedicated to the art of preparing fish for fasting days. Methods of cooking, sourcing, seasoning, and presenting fish multiplied into a complexity that would astonish a modern chef. There were salt cod preparations that involved multiple days of soaking and reconstituting. There were elaborate pike dishes cooked in wine with expensive spices. There were oyster pottages, eel roasted with ginger fresh salmon prepared with imported spices in ways that made the humble river fish taste like a luxury. The English royal household accounts from the 14th century record fasting day menus at the court of King Edward II that list dozens of fish dishes across multiple courses, an entire formal banquet structure, every bit as elaborate as a meat feast simply built entirely on fish and vegetables and permitted grains. Fasting for the wealthy was less about self-denial and more about a different kind of excess, but fish was only the beginning, because the truly creative problem for medieval cooks was not the fish itself, it was everything else. No butter, no eggs, no milk, no cheese. These were not merely flavor components, they were the fundamental building blocks of cooking as medieval Europeans understood it. Butter was for sautéing, for sauce making, for enriching. Eggs were for binding, for thickening, for structure. Milk and cream were for potages, for custards, for the rich. Round quality that gave so many dishes their depth. Without them, how do you cook? The answer was almond milk, and I want to spend a moment on this because I think it is genuinely one of the most fascinating culinary rediscoveries of our current era. We are living through an almond milk renaissance right now, with plant-based milks filling entire refrigerator sections of modern supermarkets. And almost nobody realizes that medieval European cooks were working with almond milk as a primary cooking liquid for centuries. The process was straightforward. Almonds were ground usually in a large stone mortar into a fine paste, which was then mixed with water and strained through a cloth to produce a smooth white liquid that resembled dairy milk in appearance, and in cooking could substitute for it with surprising effectiveness. Almond milk could be heated without curdling the way dairy milk sometimes did. It could be thickened with bread or starch to make sauces. It could be sweetened with honey or sugar to make desserts. It could be used to cook grains into a smooth, rich pottage that bore no resemblance to plain water-cooked porridge. Medieval recipe collections from the 13th and 14th centuries, the English form of curry, the French le viandier of Guillaume Tirel known as Thai Levant, contain dozens of recipes built on almond milk for fasting day use. These were not deprivation recipes. They were sophisticated preparations using expensive ingredients that required skill and time to produce. Almonds themselves in medieval Europe were an imported luxury. They came primarily from the Mediterranean, from Spain, from Sicily, from North Africa, and they were not cheap. Almond milk was not the budget alternative to dairy. It was in many contexts more expensive. Now here is where the story takes a turn that I genuinely love because it reveals something deeply consistently, enduringly human about the way people relate to rules they find inconvenient. The restrictions of fasting days were officially about spiritual discipline, about denying the pleasures of the body in service of the soul. But if you look at what the wealthy actually ate on fasting days, if you read the actual menus, the actual recipes, the actual household accounts, what you find is not simplicity and denial. What you find is ingenuity deployed entirely in the service of getting around the spirit of the rules while technically complying with the letter of them. Take the mock egg. During the strictest fasting periods, eggs were forbidden, but the wealthy were not willing to give up the visual experience of eggs at the table, the familiar shape, the ceremonial cracking, the sense of a complete and proper meal. So medieval cooks developed a technique for making imitation eggs using almond milk. They would blow out a real egg, carefully puncturing one end with the needle, and blowing the contents out while leaving the shell intact. Then they would prepare 2 separate almond milk preparations, one tinted gold with saffron to mimic the yolk, and one left white to mimic the egg white. They would seal one end of the shell, pour in the saffron almond milk, yolk, allow it to set, then pour in the white almond preparation to surround it, seal the other end and cook it gently. The result was a perfectly shaped egg that, when cracked open, revealed a golden center surrounded by white. No animal product anywhere in it, technically compliant with the fasting rules, completely in defiance of their spirit. I want to give these medieval cooks a standing ovation, genuinely. The creativity, the technical skill, the absolute refusal to simply accept inconvenience, this is the spirit of human ingenuity at its most delightfully petty, and it did not stop at eggs. There was imitation meat constructed from fish in shapes that resembled familiar cuts. There were elaborate ground and reformed fish dishes pressed into mould shaped like joints of pork or chicken, complete with decorative bones made from blanched almonds. These were placed on fasting day tables, looking at a glance almost identical to the meat dishes that normally appeared there. The theological creativity matched the culinary creativity. Monks at certain monasteries developed elaborate arguments about which animals counted as fish for fasting purposes. Barnacle geese, which were believed based on a genuinely extraordinary medieval misunderstanding of natural history, to hatch from barnacles on driftwood rather than being born from eggs, were classified in some communities as acceptable fasting food. They were not mammals. They seemed to emerge from the sea. Therefore fish. The beaver's tail was famously classified in some regions as acceptable fasting food, because it was broad, flat, scaly in appearance, and the beaver spent much of its time in water. Therefore aquatic. Therefore permitted. I am not making this up. Medieval theologians and church authorities spent real documented time debating whether beaver tail was meat or fish. The rabbit that was miscarried, the fetus technically was sometimes argued to have not yet become fully meat. The reasoning looked at from the outside is almost poignant in its contortion. These were serious, educated, devout people, genuinely trying to reconcile their faith with their appetites, doing the theological equivalent of what we do today, when we convince ourselves that the calories in food eaten standing up somehow do not fully count. Human nature across the centuries is remarkably consistent. But here is the aspect of fasting culture that I think carries the most genuine historical weight, and it is not the wealthy and their almond milk eggs. It is what fasting meant for people who had no alternative. For the poor, for the majority of medieval Europe's population, fasting days were not a creative culinary challenge. They were not an opportunity to demonstrate the skill of their kitchen staff. They were simply days without meat in lives that already contained very little meat to begin with. The irony of the medieval fasting system is one that historians have noted with some regularity. The people for whom fasting represented the greatest sacrifice were the people who ate the most modestly all year round. While wealthy households spent enormous resources constructing elaborate fasting day alternatives, the peasant households simply ate the grain pottage and vegetables and dried legumes that formed the backbone of their diet on ordinary days. Theologically, they were performing the same act of devotion. Practically, the experience was entirely different. Thomas Aquinas, the great 13th century theologian, actually acknowledged something close to this in his writings. He noted that fasting requirements should consider the condition of the person fasting, that children, the elderly, pregnant women, and those engaged in heavy physical labor might be legitimately exempted from full fasting obligations. In theory, at least, the Church recognized that a day of restricted eating meant something very different to a nobleman than to a field worker. Whether that recognition translated consistently into practice is another question. There is one more dimension to the fasting culture of medieval Europe that I want to leave you with, because it points forward toward a transformation in the relationship between medicine food and the body that was quietly building through the medieval period and would explode into a full cultural obsession in the Renaissance. Many fasting foods, fish, vegetables, legumes, certain grains overlapped significantly with what medieval medical theory classified as foods suited to particular bodily temperaments. The same Galenic system of hot, cold, moist and dry humours that we'll encounter properly in the next part of our story was already influencing how people thought about what was appropriate to eat and when. Lenten foods, cold, moist fish, cooling vegetables, restrained and simple preparations happen to align with what Galenic medicine considered appropriate for the cold, moist months of late winter and early spring. Was this coincidence, deliberate design, or simply the organic logic of a culture that had not yet separated medicine, religion and cuisine into the distinct disciplines we now consider them to be, probably some of all three? What it tells us is that the medieval dinner table was never just about food. It was about the body and the soul and the social order and the moral universe, all at once, all simultaneously every single day. Which is, when you think about it, a rather extraordinary amount of weight to place on a piece of salt cod. And speaking of what people believed about food and the body, we have arrived at a chapter that I find genuinely mind-bending. Because the next great force shaping what went on the medieval and Renaissance table was not the church, and it was not poverty, and it was not the availability of ingredients. It was a medical theory. A theory that had been inherited from ancient Greece, preserved through centuries of Islamic scholarship, translated back into Latin, and installed at the very centre of European medical education. A theory that told you with complete seriousness and absolute authority that what you ate needed to match your personality, that your food was essentially a prescription, that eating the wrong thing for your particular character, your specific blend of blood and phlegm and bile, could genuinely measurably make you ill. And that garlic, beautiful, fragrant, deeply flavorful garlic, was for a person of noble temperament, essentially a mild toxin. The four humours were coming to dinner, and they had opinions about everything on your plate. Close your eyes for just a second. Well, not literally, you're still listening, but imagine this. You wake up one morning in 15th century Florence feeling slightly off. Not terribly ill, just a little heavy, a little sluggish. Maybe you slept poorly. Maybe your mood is darker than usual. So you go to see your physician, and your physician does not ask you about your sleep schedule or your stress levels, or whether you've been drinking enough water. He does not take your blood pressure. He looks at you carefully, at the colour of your complexion, the quality of your pulse, perhaps the appearance of certain bodily outputs I will spare you the details of, and then he nods slowly and says something like this. Your black bile is dominant. You are running cold and dry. You need to adjust your diet immediately. More warm, moist foods, chicken broth, soft-cooked eggs, light wines, and for the love of everything holy, put down the garlic. This was not fringe medicine. This was not the advice of a quack operating on the margins of polite society. This was the mainstream university-taught, royally endorsed medical consensus of Europe for well over 1,000 years, and it shaped what people put on their dinner tables, what they cooked, what they avoided, what they served to guests of particular temperaments. what they fed their children, what they ate in summer versus winter, with an authority and a comprehensiveness that we can barely imagine today. Welcome to the world of the four humours. The theory itself was ancient, far older than medieval Europe. It originated with Hippocrates, the Greek physician, whose name we still invoke in the Hippocratic Oath writing in the 5th century before the Common Era. It was systematized and expanded by Galen of Pergamon, the Roman physician, whose influence on Western medicine was so vast and so long-lasting that his texts were still being taught in European medical schools as authoritative references as late as the 17th century. The basic framework goes like this. The human body, according to this tradition, was governed by 4 fundamental fluids, the humours: blood, which was hot and moist, associated with air, and connected to a sanguine temperament, cheerful, sociable, generous, energetic; phlegm, which was cold and moist, associated with water, producing a phlegmatic temperament, calm, slow to anger, steady, sometimes sluggish; yellow bile, which was hot and dry, associated with fire, producing a choleric temperament, energetic, ambitious, easily angered, quick to act; and black bile, which was cold and dry, associated with earth, producing a melancholic temperament, thoughtful, creative, prone to sadness and deep contemplation. Health in this framework was balance. When your 4 humours existed in the right proportions for your individual constitution, you thrived. When they fell out of balance, when one dominated too strongly or one was depleted, you became ill. And the primary tool for restoring balance, food. Every single food item in the medieval and Renaissance dietary imagination was classified according to this system. Not just hot or cold in the temperature sense, though, that was part of it, but in terms of what humoral effect it produced in the body, what it encouraged, what it suppressed, what it was good for in one person and potentially harmful for in another. The classifications were remarkably detailed, and to the modern mind sometimes wonderfully counterintuitive. Lettuce, for instance, was considered cold and moist, a cooling food appropriate in summer, good for those running too hot but potentially problematic for people of a phlegmatic constitution who were already too cool and damp by nature. Lamb was considered warm and moist, generally nourishing, relatively safe for most constitutions. Beef was hot and dry, substantial, but heavy, potentially inflaming to the choleric person already inclined toward heat and aggression. Pork was considered somewhere between moist and moderately warm acceptable, but only if properly prepared. And then there were the problem foods. Onions were hot and dry to an extreme degree, useful for certain conditions, but considered too stimulating for educated, contemplative people. Renaissance dietary writers genuinely recommended that scholars and clerics avoid onions because they were thought to inflame the passions and disturb the rational faculties. Garlic was hotter still. As I mentioned, garlic was in the vocabulary of Renaissance medical writing, essentially a food for labourers and barbers, people whose work required physical strength and who could tolerate the heat it generated. For a nobleman, a scholar or a gentleman of refined constitution, garlic was considered genuinely unsuitable. The Bolognese physician Dr. Baldassare Pisanelli, writing in 1585 near the end of the Renaissance period, put it with memorable bluntness. He wrote that the diet appropriate for a wealthy man would make a poor man ill, and the diet of a poor man would cripple a nobleman. Their physiologies, he argued, were simply different by nature of their social condition and habitual way of life. We might read that today and see class prejudice dressed up in medical language, and we would not be entirely wrong. But we should also understand that Pisanelli believed this completely and sincerely. He was not cynically using medicine to justify social hierarchy. He was working within a framework that genuinely integrated social condition, bodily constitution, and dietary need into a single coherent system. The frightening thing is not that people like Pisanelli were unusual. The frightening thing is that he was the mainstream. Now here is where it gets really interesting, and where I think the humoral system reveals something genuinely fascinating about how human beings construct meaning around food. The humoral system was not merely diagnostic. It was not just about treating illness. It was deeply, thoroughly prescriptive, meaning it told healthy people in comprehensive detail what they should and should not eat in order to maintain their health and optimize their functioning. This produced what we might recognize with a slightly unsettling feeling of familiarity as an early version of diet culture. Diet books proliferated in the Renaissance with an enthusiasm that looks almost modern. After the invention of the printing press around 1440, dietary texts became some of the most popular publications in Europe. Physicians, philosophers, and educated gentlemen wrote extensively and sold widely, books advising readers on the correct foods for their particular constitution, their particular occupation, their particular season of life. One of the most celebrated was written by Luigi Cornaro, a Venetian nobleman born around 1464, who by his own account had wrecked his health through decades of excessive eating and drinking. In his late 30s, his physicians told him he had perhaps 2 years to live. Cornaro decided to solve this problem through radical dietary restriction. He reduced his daily intake to approximately 12 ounces of food and 14 ounces of wine, carefully balanced, always appropriate to his constitution, never excessive. And then, according to his own delighted account, he lived to be nearly 100 years old. He wrote about his method in a book called Discorsi della vita sobria, which translates roughly as Discourses on the Sober Life, and it became one of the most widely read and reprinted books of the 16th century. It went through edition after edition across Europe. It was translated into multiple languages. Versions of it were still being published in the 19th century. Luigi Cornaro, lean and ancient and deeply pleased with himself, was essentially the first wellness influencer, and the framework he used, calibrating food intake to constitutional type eating, moderately avoiding excess of any particular humor-disturbing food, was pure Galenic humoral theory, applied with personal conviction and exceptional marketing instincts. But let me come back to the dinner table specifically, because I want to show you how this theory actually translated into what people cooked and served. In a wealthy Renaissance household, a cook who understood the humoral system, and good cooks were expected to understand it, would think about menu design in ways that no modern chef is trained to consider. The order of courses, for instance, was not arbitrary. Foods that were considered easy to digest, lighter, more easily assimilated by the body, were served first to open the stomach gently. Heavier, denser foods came later when the digestive process was already engaged. Fruit was a special case. There was significant debate among humoral physicians about whether fruit should be eaten at the beginning or end of a meal, and different schools of thought argued the question seriously for centuries. The service of wine was calibrated to food, lighter wines with lighter dishes, fuller wines with heavier meats, and always diluted, because undiluted wine was considered too heating, too drying, too agitating to the humoral balance. The temperature of food mattered. Serving very cold food in winter was considered potentially harmful to digestion, the cold contracting the stomach and impeding the body's natural warmth. Serving very hot food in summer was similarly problematic. Sauces were designed not just for flavor, but for humoral correction. A piece of beef, hot and dry, might be served with a sauce made from verjuice, the tart juice of unripe grapes, which was considered cooling and moistening. The sauce was not just a complement to the meat. It was the medical counterbalance to the meat. The cook was in a very real sense practicing medicine. Does any of this remind you of anything I ask with genuine curiosity rather than any smugness? Because I think the honest answer is yes, quite a lot of it. We live in an era of extraordinary nutritional science. We have studies, clinical trials, molecular biology, a genuine understanding of macronutrients and micronutrients and gut microbiomes and inflammatory markers that the humoral physicians could not have imagined in their most ambitious dreams. And yet, we still reach for kombucha because it is supposed to be good for our gut. We still avoid certain foods because they are inflammatory, a word that carries in modern wellness culture almost exactly the same kind of expansive, slightly vague, lifestyle-defining weight that choleric carried in the 15th century. We still read books telling us that our specific blood type, or our specific metabolic constitution, or our specific ancestral heritage determines what we should and should not eat. We still look for a system that connects food, body, and well-being into a single coherent narrative. The specific theory changes. The human hunger for that narrative does not. I find this both humbling and oddly reassuring. It suggests that the need to make sense of what we eat to load our food with meaning beyond mere nutrition is not a modern neurosis. It is something ancient, something deeply wired into the same brain that sat around a fire 1,000,000 years ago and told stories in the dark. We are still doing it. We are just using different vocabulary. There is one more dimension of the humoral dining tradition that I want to share before we move on because it is specific and strange and wonderful in equal measure. The question of who ate which foods was not just about individual constitution. It was about social rank. And this is where the humoral system and the existing social hierarchy of medieval and Renaissance Europe performed a seamless, mutually reinforcing dance. Remember what I mentioned earlier, that foods were classified not just by their humoral properties, but by their position in the natural world. Low-to-the-ground root vegetables, garlic onions, were considered suitable for people of a low social station. High in the air, birds' fruit from tall trees, anything that grew or lived at elevation were considered appropriate for people of high social rank. This was not metaphor. It was literal belief. Pheasant was food for nobility. Partridge, peacock, quail. These birds lived high, flew high, were constitutionally elevated. Their meat was considered correspondingly fine and appropriate for fine constitutions. Turnips grew underground. They were cold-heavy, suitable for peasants whose constitutions had been hardened by outdoor labour. Venison, the meat of deer, which were noble animals hunted exclusively by the nobility, was considered constitutionally appropriate for noblemen. Legal restrictions on hunting reinforced the dietary theory, and the dietary theory reinforced the legal restrictions. It was a perfect self-sealing system. The foods appropriate for your station were the foods you were allowed to eat, which were also conveniently the foods that your constitution formed by your station was suited to receive. The humoral system did not create social hierarchy, but it gave social hierarchy a medical certificate. What strikes me most deeply about all of this, looking back across the centuries at the humoral physicians and their elaborate dietary prescriptions, their hot and cold and moist and dry, their carefully calibrated seasonal menus and their sincere, thorough, completely incorrect medical reasoning is not the wrongness of it. It is the earnestness. These were people trying with everything they had to understand the connection between what they ate and how they felt. They were paying attention in the most careful way they knew how to the relationship between food and body and well-being, and they were doing it within the best intellectual framework available to them, a framework they had inherited, tested against experience, and refined across generations. They were wrong about the mechanism. They were not wrong that the mechanism exists. Food does affect mood. It does affect energy. It does affect cognitive function. It does interact with individual physiology in ways that vary meaningfully from person to person. They were in a strange way asking exactly the right questions. They just did not have the tools to find the right answers yet. And speaking of questions that people asked with passionate intensity and answered with confident incorrectness, we're about to meet an era that raised the art of elaborate theatrical power, obsessed dining to heights that the humoral physicians with all their careful calibrations could never have prescribed. Because the Renaissance banquet was not just a meal, it was a weapon, a carefully engineered instrument of political communication, social domination, and sheer spectacular intimidation. And at the centre of it all stood the figure of the Renaissance lord, standing at the head of a table long enough to seat 100 guests, watching his cooks carry in a whole roasted peacock with its feathers replaced to look alive, and thinking not about flavour, not about nourishment, not about the humoral balance of his guests' constitutions. Thinking about power. Thinking about what this room full of people would say about him when they left. Thinking about what a dinner could do that an army sometimes could not. The banquet as propaganda was about to begin. The year is 1574. The place is a chateau along the river Loire in France, one of those impossibly elegant French country estates that look like someone dreamed them up specifically to make the rest of the world feel architecturally inadequate. And inside that chateau something is happening that has been in preparation for 6 months. Not a military campaign, not a diplomatic negotiation, not a coronation, a dinner. Specifically a dinner hosted by Catherine de Medici, now Queen Mother of France, for her son King Charles IX and the assembled nobility of the French court. A dinner that by the time the final accounts were settled had cost the equivalent of what several hundred ordinary French households spent on food in an entire year. The menu alone ran to dozens of courses. The table decorations included sculpted sugar centerpieces of extraordinary complexity. There were multiple kitchens running simultaneously, coordinated by a small army of cooks. Live music played continuously. There were theatrical performances between courses, acrobats, dancers, and every single element, every dish, every decoration, every carefully choreographed entrance of food into the hall had been designed with one primary purpose: not to nourish anyone, to communicate power. Now I want to be careful here because Catherine appears again in our story tonight in a different role than the one we met her in earlier. Previously we talked about her bringing the fork and Italian culinary culture to France, the intimate personal dimension of her influence on the dinner table. Tonight we're looking at something altogether different and more calculated. The Renaissance banquet as political theatre, and to understand it properly you need to understand something about the particular vulnerability of power in Renaissance Europe. Loyalty was not guaranteed by law. It was not enforced by permanent bureaucratic institutions the way it is today. It was a living, breathing, constantly renegotiated relationship between rulers and the powerful nobles beneath them. A great lord's loyalty to his king depended more than modern people generally appreciate on a continuous, ongoing series of demonstrations that the king was worth following, that the king was powerful, that the king was generous, that the king was the kind of person whose table you wanted to sit at. The banquet was where this demonstration happened in its most concentrated form. To host a feast of overwhelming magnificence was not extravagance in the modern sense, money spent frivolously, wastefully on personal pleasure. It was investment, political infrastructure, the cost of maintaining the social architecture on which your entire reign depended. And the rulers of Renaissance Europe understood this with a clarity and a strategic sophistication that is genuinely impressive. Let me tell you about a specific banquet, one that I think captures the essence of all of this with almost painful precision. In the summer of 1661, Nicolas Fouquet, the finance minister of France under the young King Louis XIV, hosted what is widely considered one of the most spectacular private dinner parties in the history of Western civilization. He held it at his new chateau at Vaux-le-Vicomte, a property he had spent the equivalent of a staggering fortune building and decorating over several years, employing the finest architects, painters, landscape designers, and craftspeople in Europe. The guest of honour was the king himself. 6,000 guests attended. The menu included dishes prepared by the finest cooks in France. The gardens were illuminated by 20,000 candles. There were fireworks. There were theatrical performances, one of them written specifically for the occasion by the playwright Molière. There was a lottery in which guests won prizes, including horses. The food alone required an estimated 300 cooks working for weeks. The entertainment lasted until 2 a.m. By every measure, aesthetic, logistical, culinary, theatrical, it was an unqualified triumph. And it destroyed Nicolas Fouquet completely. Because King Louis XIV, sitting at that table, eating that food, watching those fireworks reflected in those candles, arrived at a very simple, very dangerous conclusion. His finance minister was richer than he was. His finance minister was throwing a better party than the King of France could throw. His finance minister was in the language of power that Renaissance banquet spoke so fluently, outranking him at his own dinner. 3 weeks after the feast at Vaux-le-Vicomte, Louis had Fouquet arrested on charges of embezzlement. He was tried, convicted, and spent the rest of his life, nearly 2 decades, imprisoned in a fortress in the Alps. He died there. The king then hired Fouquet's architect, his landscape designer, and his chief decorator and used them to build Versailles. The banquet had spoken. The king had listened. And the lesson that every subsequent French aristocrat drew from this episode was crystal clear. At a Renaissance banquet, the most important thing on the table is not the food. It is the message. And you had better make absolutely certain the message you are sending is the right one. But the Renaissance banquet was not only a tool of intimidation and political calculation, it was also, and this is the dimension I find most fascinating, a medium of artistic expression that rivaled painting, sculpture, and architecture in its ambition and its technical complexity. The great chef of this era that I want to tell you about tonight is Bartolomeo Scarpi. If you have not heard this name before, I want to plant it firmly in your memory, because Scarpi was by any reasonable measure the greatest chef of the 16th century, and quite possibly one of the most extraordinary culinary figures in all of Western history. He worked as the personal chef to Pope Pius V, a position of extraordinary prestige since the papal court in Rome was one of the most important and most scrutinized dining venues in all of Europe. And in 1570 he published a cookbook called Opera Simply Works that was so comprehensive, so detailed, and so technically sophisticated that food historians still study it today as one of the foundational documents of European culinary tradition. The opera contained over 1,000 recipes. To put that in context, the most celebrated French cookbook of the previous century, the Le Viandier of Taillevent, contained around 200. Scarpi's work was 5 times larger and in many ways 5 times more technically demanding. It included recipes for roasted meats, braised dishes, pastries, preserves, and elaborate confections. It described cooking techniques in more precise detail than any cookbook before it. It included, and this is the detail that particularly delights me, detailed illustrations of kitchen equipment, including what appears to be one of the earliest documented depictions of a fork being used as an eating utensil. Scarpi also, and this is extraordinary, described in careful detail exactly how food was delivered to a papal conclave. The Vatican's conclave is the locked meeting in which cardinals elect a new pope, and during which they are sealed inside and have no contact with the outside world. Scarpi described the special revolving compartments built into the walls through which food baskets were passed to the cardinals, a level of operational detail about one of the most secretive institutions in Christendom, that suggests Scappi had a level of access and a level of trust that was genuinely remarkable for a cook. He was not merely a craftsman in the kitchen, he was an insider, and the food that Scappi and his contemporaries produced for Renaissance banquets was theatrical in a way that goes beyond anything I have described so far tonight. The roasted peacock that I mentioned at the close of our last section, let me give you the full picture of that because it is worth it. A peacock was not simply roasted and served. The preparation began by carefully removing the bird's skin intact, with all its magnificent feathers still attached. The peacock was then roasted, which in a 16th century kitchen meant hours of careful turning on a spit over an open fire. Once cooked, the skin and feathers were carefully replaced around the roasted bird, which was then positioned on a platter, with its tail fanned out in full display. Sometimes the beak was gilded with gold leaf. Sometimes a small piece of camphor-soaked cotton was placed in the beak and lit just before the dish was carried into the hall, so that the peacock appeared to breathe fire as it was paraded among the tables. A fire-breathing peacock, carried through a candlelit hall, to demonstrate that you were a person of sufficient wealth, sophistication, and culinary ambition to produce something like this. I genuinely do not know what to say about this except these people were committed. Whatever else you want to say about Renaissance banquet culture, the commitment to the spectacle was absolute. There is a question buried in all of this that I want to ask you directly. When you host people for dinner, or when you attend a dinner that someone else has hosted, what are you actually communicating? Most of us most of the time would say, we are just feeding people. We just want everyone to enjoy themselves. The food is just the point. But is it really? Think about the last time you had people over for a meal that you cared about, the extra effort you put in, the decision about what to cook, whether to use the good dishes or the everyday ones, whether to light candles, what music to play, how the table looked. All of those decisions were communicating something about who you are, about what you value, about how you see the people you invited and how you want them to see you. The Renaissance lord with his fire-breathing peacock and his 6,000 candles was doing exactly the same thing, just at a somewhat different budget. The impulse to turn the table into a statement, to use food and its presentation as a language, is not a Renaissance invention. We traced it all the way back to the Roman triclinium, to the position of the couches, to who reclined where. We traced it further back still to the first fire and the first circle of shared warmth. It is one of the most ancient and most consistent human behaviours there is. We have always been saying something with what we put on the table. Now, one aspect of the Renaissance banquet that I have not touched on yet, and that I think provides the most humanly interesting window into this world, is what happened to the guests who were specifically not at the centre of it. Because the Renaissance banquet had a seating geography of extraordinary social precision. The long tables of a great feast hall were arranged so that the host and the most important guests sat at the elevated end, literally higher, often on a raised platform in full view of everyone present. The food that arrived at their end of the table was different, better, more elaborately prepared, more generously portioned. As you moved down the table, physically downward away from the host, the food changed. Guests of lesser importance received simpler dishes, smaller portions, less elaborate presentations, different quality of wine. This was not accidental. It was not a logistical compromise. It was a deliberate, visible public statement about exactly where every person in the room stood in the social order. To be seated far down the table to receive the lesser wine, the simpler dish, was a public assessment of your worth, and everyone in the room could see it. The table was a map of the social world, and every guest who walked into the hall and found their seat was being told in the most public possible way exactly where they appeared on that map. I find myself thinking about this sometimes at modern dinner parties, The quiet, mostly unconscious calculations about who sits where, who gets the better view, who ends up next to the interesting guest, and who ends up next to the wall. We're more polite about it now, more deliberate about seeming egalitarian, but the calculus has not entirely disappeared. We have just learned to do it more quietly. The Renaissance banquet reached its apotheosis, its highest and most extreme expression, in the courts of the great European monarchies of the late 16th and early 17th centuries. And then slowly something shifted. The sheer scale became almost absurd. The logistical complexity became genuinely unmanageable. The cost became unsustainable for all but the wealthiest rulers, and perhaps most importantly, the political landscape began to change in ways that made the banquet a less effective instrument of power. The emergence of print culture, of permanent bureaucracies, of standing armies, of the early modern state, all of these gradually transferred the levers of power away from the personal theatrical face-to-face world of the banquet hall. You did not need to feed 300 nobles under candlelight to command their loyalty if you had a permanent bureaucratic apparatus, a professional army and a tax collection system that operated regardless of whether they came to your table. The banquet did not disappear, but its political urgency diminished, and as the great Renaissance banquets slowly gave way to something more contained, more domestic, more intimate, as the long tables and fire-breathing peacocks retreated into history, a new kind of dining was quietly emerging in the cities of Europe. Not at a lord's table, not in a palace or a chateau or a hall decorated for 1,000 guests. In a small, unpretentious shop on a crowded urban street, where anyone at all, regardless of rank or connection or whether they had received an invitation, could walk in, sit down and order a meal. The restaurant was being born, and its story is stranger and older and more geographically surprising than almost anyone expects. Right. Let me ask you something that seems simple, but actually has a surprisingly complicated answer. When did humans first start paying strangers to feed them not at a lord's table, not as a guest or a servant or a traveller taking what was offered at a monastery hostel, but as a customer, an independent person walking into a place, sitting down at a table that was not someone's private home, looking at a list of available dishes, choosing what they wanted, paying for it and leaving? When did that begin? Most people, if they have thought about it at all, would probably say somewhere in Europe, France, perhaps in the 18th century. The word restaurant is French after all. The whole romantic mythology of the bistro and the café feels so thoroughly, so quintessentially French, that it is hard to imagine the story starting anywhere else. But the story does not start in France. It does not start in Europe at all. And it is several centuries older than most people suspect. Let us go somewhere unexpected tonight. Let us go to the city of Kaifeng in the Henan province of what is now central China in the year 1120. Kaifeng was at that moment one of the largest and most sophisticated cities on earth. It was the capital of the Song dynasty, a civilization that was by virtually any measure of cultural and technological development significantly ahead of contemporary medieval Europe. Kaifeng had a population of somewhere between 1 and 1.5 million people at its height, at a time when the largest cities in Europe, Paris, London, held perhaps 50 to 100,000. It had a complex monetary economy, sophisticated banking instruments, woodblock printing, gunpowder technology, and crucially for our story tonight, a thriving, diverse, highly developed culture of eating in public. We know this in extraordinary detail because of a single remarkable historical source, a painting, specifically a scroll painting called Qingming Shang He Tu, which translates roughly as Along the River During the Qingming Festival. Painted by the artist Zhang Ziduan during the Northern Song dynasty, probably in the early 12th century, it depicts life in and around Kaifeng with a documentary precision that is almost journalistic, And embedded in that extraordinary scroll among the bridges and the boats and the city gates and the market stalls are clear depictions of what can only be described as restaurants. Multi-story establishments with signboards, tables and chairs visible inside, customers seated being served by staff. Some of the buildings are large enough to accommodate dozens of guests simultaneously across multiple floors. Alongside the scroll, we've written accounts from the same era, most notably a memoir called Dongjing Menghua Lu, or Dreams of Splendor of the Eastern Capital, written by a man named Meng Yuanlao sometime around 1147, recording his memories of Kaifeng before it fell to the Jurchen Jin dynasty. Meng Yuanlao describes the city's food culture with the wistful detail of someone describing a paradise that has been lost, and what he describes is an elaborate, varied, competitive restaurant industry of genuine sophistication. There were establishments that specialized in specific regional cuisines. There were restaurants open through the night catering to those returning from entertainments or working late hours. There were establishments of different price points, from grand multi-story restaurants serving elaborate banquets to small stalls offering quick, inexpensive meals to people passing through the markets. There were printed menus. Let me say that again because I want it to land properly. In 11th and 12th century Song dynasty, China restaurant customers were presented with printed lists of available dishes from which they could choose according to their preference and their budget. A menu in 1100. We did not get printed restaurant menus in Western Europe until the late 18th century at the earliest, but China was not alone in this, and the story gets richer if we cast the net a little wider. Go back further in time and further west, all the way back to ancient Rome, which we visited earlier in our journey tonight, but from a different angle now. Because ancient Rome, for all the private dining culture of the triclinium that we explored, was also a city of extraordinary public eating. Archaeologists excavating Pompeii, preserved by the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 of the Common Era, have identified at least 80 establishments that fit the description of what we might call food service operations. The Latin term was thermopolium, from the Greek words for hot and to sell, literally a place that sells hot things. 80 thermopolia in a single mid-sized Roman city. These were not fine dining establishments. They were in many ways closer to what we might call a fast food counter today. They had stone counters built into the street front with large ceramic vessels dolia set into the counter and used to keep food warm. Customers would walk up point at what they wanted, pay a small amount, and either eat standing at the counter or take the food away. The menus, and here is the detail I love most, were painted directly onto the walls. Archaeologists have found faded painted lists of available dishes on the walls of several Pompeii thermopolia, along with prices, meatballs, lentils, fried fish, bread, wine sold by the cup. A wall-painted menu in a working-class food stall in a Roman city buried by a volcano nearly 2,000 years ago. Every time I think about that, I feel this strange, warm, slightly vertiginous connection across time, because the fundamental transaction, person walks in person, looks at available options, person exchanges money for food, person eats, is identical to what happens 10,000 times a day in every city on Earth right now. The vessel changes, the currency changes, the specific dishes change, the human need does not. Now here is the part where I want to complicate the picture a little. Because the history of public eating is not a simple straight line from ancient Roman street food to the modern restaurant. It is messier than that, more discontinuous, more geographically varied, and the discontinuities tell us something important. After the fall of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century, the dense urban food culture of Rome largely disappeared in Western Europe. Cities shrank dramatically. The economic complexity that had supported a street food industry, the large urban populations, the monetary economy, the supply chains contracted sharply. For several centuries in Western Europe, eating in public in an organized way was primarily the province of travellers. Inns and taverns served food, but not in the way we would recognize as restaurant dining. You ate what was provided at a common table at the time the innkeeper decided to serve. There was no menu, there was no choice. You were a guest in someone else's household and you ate what the household offered. This is a crucial distinction. The word restaurant comes from the French word restaurad, to restore, to fortify, and the specific invention that the French do genuinely claim with some historical justification is not the concept of public eating itself, but something more precise and more philosophically interesting. The individual portion, served at the time of the customer's choosing, from a written list of options, with the specific promise of restoring the customer's health and vigour. The story goes like this. In Paris, sometime around 1765, a man named Monsieur Boulanger, whose first name history has not preserved with certainty, which is a little sad, opened an establishment on the Rue des Poulies, where he sold what he called restaurants, restorative broths and soups, presented as health-giving preparations for people whose constitutions needed strengthening. This was at its origin a medical claim, a nod to the humoral tradition we explored in our last section, the idea that certain foods properly prepared could restore the body's balance. Boulanger was not primarily selling a meal, he was selling a remedy. But what made his establishment genuinely new was the structure of the experience. Customers sat at their own individual tables, not at a common board shared with strangers. They ordered from available options at a time of their own choosing. They were served individually. They paid individually. They were treated, in other words, not as travellers or guests or supplicants, but as customers with preferences and autonomy. Can I ask you something genuinely personal here? Think about the last time you sat down in a restaurant, any restaurant anywhere from a quiet corner cafe to somewhere with linen napkins and a wine list longer than most novels. What did that experience give you beyond the food itself? For most people, I think the answer involves something like freedom. The freedom to choose, to not have to cook, to not have to clean up, to not have to be a guest in someone's home, with all the social obligations that implies, the freedom to be for an hour or two in a public space that is simultaneously private, where you're surrounded by strangers but occupying your own small territory of table and chair and conversation. The French Revolution, which arrived less than 3 decades after Boulanger opened his doors, accelerated the growth of Parisian restaurant culture in a very specific and historically interesting way. The great aristocratic households whose elaborate kitchens had employed some of the finest trained cooks in Europe were in many cases dismantled. The nobles who had employed those cooks were scattered, fled imprisoned, or worse, and several hundred highly skilled professional cooks found themselves suddenly without employers. They opened restaurants. The culinary expertise that had previously been locked inside private palaces serving the exclusive tables of the aristocracy moved out onto the street. By 1800, Paris had somewhere between 500 and 600 restaurants. By 1825, the number had grown to over 3,000. Within a few decades, the restaurant had transformed from a novelty into the defining institution of urban social life, not just in France, but across Europe, and eventually the world. But there is one more chapter in the restaurant story that I want to take you to, because it involves a place and a time that almost nobody thinks about in this context, and it reshapes the whole picture. Ancient Rome gave us the Thermopolium, Song Dynasty. China gave us the multi-story restaurant with printed menus in 1100. Revolutionary France gave us the modern restaurant as an institution of individual freedom and professional culinary expertise. But there is a fourth place in this story. The Islamic world of the medieval period, specifically the great cities of Baghdad, Cairo, and Cordoba, between roughly the 8th and 13th centuries, developed a sophisticated culture of public eating that has been relatively underexplored in Western food history, partly because the primary sources are in Arabic and have been less accessible to European and American scholars. Baghdad, during the Abbasid Caliphate at its height in the 9th and 10th centuries, was probably the most cosmopolitan city on earth. It had a population of perhaps 500,000 to 1 million people, a vast, diverse, intellectually extraordinary metropolis where scholars, merchants, and travellers from across Asia, Africa, and Europe converged. And it had a thriving public food culture. The Arabic term was matbakh for a kitchen establishment, or more specifically, ta'am, sellers, vendors of prepared food. But beyond simple street selling, there are documented accounts of establishments where prepared meals were served to seated customers in dedicated spaces, some of them associated with caravanserais, the great roadside inns of the Islamic world, but others operating independently in urban markets. The 10th century cookbook Kitab al-Tabikh, the Book of Dishes, compiled by the Iraqi author Muhammad bin Hassan al-Baghdadi, gives us a window into the culinary sophistication of this culture. It is full of complex, carefully calibrated recipes, reflecting a food culture that had absorbed Persian, Indian, Byzantine, and Arab culinary traditions into something genuinely syncretic and refined. This was not a backward, simple food world waiting for France to invent the restaurant. This was a global culinary conversation happening simultaneously across multiple civilizations, each one developing in its own way the infrastructure of public eating that the modern world would eventually inherit. What I find most moving about the whole long arc of this story, from the Roman Thermopylaeum to the Song Dynasty restaurant to Boulanger's broth to the 3,000 Parisian restaurants of 1825, is what it reveals about the relationship between cities and eating. The restaurant in all its forms, across all its cultures and centuries, is fundamentally an urban institution. It requires density, enough people living closely enough together that someone can make a living cooking for strangers. It requires a degree of anonymity, the freedom to eat among people who do not know you, who are not your family or your lord or your community. It requires a monetary economy sophisticated enough to support individual commercial transactions over something as intimate as a meal. Every time a new civilization developed these conditions, urban density, individual autonomy, commercial economy restaurants emerged. Not because anyone planned them, but because the need was always there. The need to eat, the need to rest, the need to be somewhere warm and fed without obligation, the need perhaps most basically to be nourished by a stranger's care. And yet, for all the extraordinary story of how public eating developed, the vast majority of meals in human history were not eaten in restaurants or at lords' tables or in papal kitchens or among the elaborate confections of the Renaissance banquet. They were eaten at home by ordinary people from bowls and cups and whatever implements were at hand, seasoned with whatever was growing in the garden or available at the market or left over from the day before. And among all those ordinary meals eaten by ordinary people whose names history has not preserved, there is one ingredient whose journey from the table of kings to the bowl of the poorest person on earth is among the most extraordinary, most morally complex, and most consequential stories in the history of food. It is white, it is fine, it is sitting in your kitchen right now, probably in a small ceramic bowl or a paper bag near the stove, and it was once so rare, so expensive, so coveted by the powerful, that a single loaf sweetened with it was a gift worthy of a monarch. And then it became something else entirely, something that reshaped continents, and left a shadow that we are still honestly still living inside of. Sugar is waiting for us, and its story is not sweet at all. Somewhere in your kitchen right now there is a small container of white crystalline powder that you almost certainly take completely for granted. You use it without thinking. You add it to coffee, to baking, to sauces, to things you do not even realize contain it. It sits in its bowl or its bag near the stove, unremarkable, domestic, utterly ordinary. And yet this substance, this thing you've probably touched a dozen times this week without a second thought, was once so rare that it was stored in locked boxes, so expensive that it was sold by the gram at apothecary shops next to medicinal herbs and imported remedies, so coveted by the powerful that a single cone of it wrapped in paper was considered a gift appropriate for a king, and so transformative in the darkest possible sense of that word, that the hunger for it remapped the entire Atlantic world, built fortunes on the suffering of millions of human beings, and permanently altered the demographics, the economies and the food cultures of multiple continents simultaneously. Sugar's journey from royal medicine to democratic staple is, I believe, the single most consequential food story in human history, and tonight we're going to follow it from beginning to end. Let us start where the story starts, not in the Caribbean, not in colonial Europe, not in the court of any king, but in the tropical lowlands of New Guinea roughly 8,000 years ago. Sugarcane Saccharum officinarum, to use its full botanical name, is a grass. A remarkably tall, thick, fast-growing grass that produces stalks dense with a sweet juice, that when extracted and processed yields the crystalline substance we know as sugar. It was first domesticated in New Guinea, and over several thousand years it spread westward through Southeast Asia and India, carried by traders and travellers along the same routes that moved spices and silk and ideas across the ancient world. India is where sugar processing, the art of actually extracting juice from the cane and crystallizing it into a solid form, was first developed probably around 300 to 400 of the Common Era. Sanskrit texts from this period contain some of the earliest written references to sakkara, which means gravel or sand, in Sanskrit referring to the granular texture of crystallized sugar. This Sanskrit word is the direct ancestor of the Arabic sukha, which became the medieval Latin saccharum, which became the French sucre, which became the English word sugar. The word has been travelling almost as long as the substance itself. When Arab armies expanded their empire across the Middle East, Persia and North Africa, in the 7th and 8th centuries they encountered sugar cultivation and brought both the knowledge and the cane with them. By the 9th and 10th centuries, sugar cane was being cultivated in Sicily in the Iberian Peninsula and along the eastern Mediterranean coast, and refined sugar was beginning to arrive in Western Europe, via the same Arab trading networks that also carried the spices we discussed earlier. And the initial European encounter with sugar was, this is the part that always surprises people, almost entirely medicinal. In the earliest European references to sugar, it appears not in cookbooks but in medical texts. Arab physicians had incorporated sugar into their pharmacopoeia, where it was used as a vehicle for delivering medicines, something to make bitter remedies more palatable and as a treatment in its own right for certain conditions affecting the throat, the stomach and the chest. When sugar first appeared in English records around the 11th and 12th centuries, it was listed alongside pepper and ginger and cinnamon in the accounts of apothecary shops. Not grocers. Apothecaries. It was medicine. And like all medicines of sufficient rarity and expense, it was also status. Here is a specific detail that I find genuinely difficult to get my head around, even after spending considerable time with this history. In 13th century England, refined white sugar cost somewhere between 1 and 2 shillings per pound. To put that in context, a skilled craftsman in 13th century England might earn 2 to 3 shillings for an entire week of labour. A pound of sugar could cost a craftsman a week's wages, and yet at the tables of English royalty and high nobility sugar appeared with extraordinary frequency, not just as a sweetener, but as a medium. The same sculptural confections we touched on briefly when we discussed medieval subtleties were built in their most elaborate forms from refined sugar paste. Castles, ships, animals, coats of arms, all constructed from a material that was gram for gram among the most expensive substances at the table. The household accounts of King Edward I of England covering the late 13th century record purchases of sugar running into hundreds of pounds per year, not for the whole kingdom, for the royal household's personal consumption. Sugar in those quantities at those prices represented an expenditure that most English people of that era could not have comprehended, let alone afforded. And this extraordinary luxury status is exactly why what happened next is so historically significant. Because something changed. The question is what? The answer begins in the Atlantic Ocean in the mid-15th century with the Portuguese. Portugal in the 1400s was a small kingdom on the western edge of Europe, with significant maritime ambitions and very limited land resources. What it had was coastline-skilled sailors and the political will backed by Prince Henry, the figure history knows as Henry the Navigator, to push systematically outward into the Atlantic in search of new trade routes, new resources and new possibilities. In the 1430s and 1440s, Portuguese sailors discovered and settled the Madeira Islands, a group of volcanic islands in the Atlantic, about 1,000 kilometers off the coast of Morocco. The islands had good soil, warm climate and abundant rainfall. The Portuguese planted sugarcane and discovered that Madeira was almost perfectly suited for its cultivation. Within a few decades, Madeira had become the largest sugar producer in the Western world. The island's economy was restructured entirely around sugar production, and to work the cane fields at the scale required for profitable production, the Portuguese began importing enslaved workers from the West African coast. This is the moment in the 1450s and 1460s on a small Atlantic island most people today have never visited, where the sugar story becomes something we cannot tell without grief. Because what began in Madeira became over the following 3 centuries one of the most systematic and devastating forced migrations in human history. When Columbus arrived in the Caribbean in 1492, that same voyage we mentioned earlier, the one that began as a search for spices, he brought sugarcane with him on his second voyage in 1493. He had seen what it had done for Madeira. He understood what the Caribbean climate could do for sugarcane cultivation. He was right. The scale of what developed over the following 2 centuries in the Caribbean and Brazil is almost impossible to hold in the mind all at once. By 1600, Brazil was producing the majority of the world's sugar supply on plantations worked by enslaved Africans transported across the Atlantic in conditions of almost unimaginable horror. By 1650, English colonies in Barbados had converted almost entirely to sugar cultivation. By 1700, Jamaica, Hispaniola, Cuba, and the other major Caribbean islands were essentially sugar machines. Their entire economies, their entire social structures, their entire physical landscapes reshaped around the production of a single sweetener for European tables. The numbers are staggering. Historians estimate that between the 1500s and the 1800s, somewhere between 10 and 12 million Africans were transported across the Atlantic as enslaved labor, the majority of them destined for sugar cultivation in the Americas and the Caribbean. Of those, somewhere between 1 and 2 million died during the crossing alone. On the sugar plantations themselves, conditions were brutal beyond description. The work of cutting cane was extraordinarily physically demanding. The processing work feeding cane into the crushing mills, managing the boiling houses where juice was reduced and crystallized, was dangerous in ways that produced constant injury. Life expectancy on a sugar plantation was shockingly short. Many plantation owners calculated that it was economically more efficient to work enslaved people to their limits and replace them than to moderate the pace of work. The sugar bowl on a 17th century English breakfast table was the end point of a chain of suffering that stretched across an ocean. I think it is important to say this clearly without flinching, not to be grim for its own sake, but because the story of sugar cannot be told honestly without it. The sweetness on European tables and the horror of the plantation were not separate stories. They were the same story. One could not exist without the other. And here is the deeply uncomfortable irony at the heart of all of this. The very success of the plantation system, the extraordinary productivity it achieved through the use of forced labour, is what made sugar cheap. By the mid-17th century, sugar prices in England had fallen dramatically from their medieval highs. By the early 18th century, sugar had moved from being a luxury of the aristocracy to being a regular purchase for the growing English middle class. By the late 18th century, it had become accessible to working-class families as well. The English historian Sidney Mintz, in his landmark 1985 study Sweetness and Power, traces this democratization with careful precision. He documents how across the 18th century sugar moved from the center of aristocratic display. Remember the medieval sugar castles and the royal household accounts into the everyday diets of ordinary English people. First, as a sweetener for the newly fashionable beverages of tea and coffee and chocolate, and eventually as a staple ingredient in cooking at every level of society. By 1800, the average English person was consuming roughly 18 pounds of sugar per year. By 1900, that figure had climbed to approximately 90 pounds. Today, estimates for average American sugar consumption run to somewhere between 70 and 100 pounds per person per year, a figure that includes not just the sugar you consciously add to things, but the sugar embedded in processed foods, sauces, breads, condiments, beverages. The substance that once cost a craftsman a week's wages is now so cheap and so ubiquitous that most people consume it in quantities they genuinely do not know about. There is one specific story within the sugar story that I want to share because it captures something essential about the way this history felt to the people living inside it, at least to some of them. In the 1780s and 1790s, a movement emerged in Britain that called itself the sugar boycott. At its peak, somewhere between 300,000 and 500,000 British people refused to buy or consume sugar produced by enslaved labour in the Caribbean. This was not a fringe movement. It was organised, widespread, and explicitly linked to the emerging abolitionist campaign that was simultaneously working through Parliament to end the slave trade. The people who participated in the boycott were making a statement that feels remarkably contemporary, that what you choose to put in your body, what you choose to buy, what you choose to consume is a moral act, that the supply chain matters, that the pleasure on your tongue is connected to what happened at every point before it reached you. They were sitting at their kitchen tables looking at the sugar bowl and choosing to see what was behind it. The boycott did not end the trade in enslaved people. That required decades more of political struggle, and its formal abolition in British territories came in 1833. Though the labour exploitation of the Caribbean sugar industry continued in modified forms long after that, and the economic and social consequences of those centuries of forced labour continue to shape the region to this day. But the boycott matters as a moment in the history of food consciousness, because it represents something rare and genuinely significant, a large group of ordinary people deciding that the history of an ingredient was inseparable from the experience of eating it. That food is never just food, that every bite carries a story, and that the story matters. Let me ask you something, and I mean it with complete sincerity. Is there something you eat or drink regularly, something you genuinely enjoy, whose full supply chain you would rather not think about too carefully? Most of us, I think, have at least one thing, maybe several, and I am not asking this to generate guilt. Genuinely, I am not. The world we live in makes it nearly impossible to trace every ingredient in every meal to its complete and unambiguous ethical origin. That is a real structural problem, not a personal moral failing. But I ask because the history of sugar teaches something that I think is worth sitting with quietly in the dark before sleep. The separation between the pleasure of eating and the full reality of where food comes from, that separation is not natural. It is not inevitable. It is a construction. A distance we create and maintain, and most of the time prefer not to close. The people who participated in the sugar boycott of the 1780s chose deliberately to close that distance. They decided that knowing was part of eating. And I think there is something in that, something that resonates well beyond the specific historical moment that is worth carrying forward. From medicine to monarchy to mass market to moral reckoning, sugar's journey through history is in miniature the journey of the dinner table itself. From a thing that was rare, precious, and restricted to the very few, to something ordinary, abundant, and available to nearly everyone. And with that democratization, that extraordinary expansion of access, came not simplicity, but new complexity, new questions, new responsibilities. The dinner table has never just been about food. We've been saying that in different ways across every single chapter of this story. But perhaps no ingredient makes the point more starkly than the white crystals in a small bowl by your stove. There is one more chapter in the story of the dinner table that we have not yet visited tonight, and it is the one I have been looking forward to telling you the most. Because everything we have covered so far, the fire and the feast, the humours and the church, the spices and the forks and the banquets and the restaurants and the sugar, all of it, has been in one way or another about how other people ate, how the wealthy ate, how the powerful ate, how the institutions shaped what appeared on the table and why. But the people we have spent the least time with tonight are perhaps the most important ones. The vast majority, the quiet majority, the ordinary people of medieval and early modern Europe going about their daily lives at tables that history barely recorded. And among all those invisible tables there is one group whose story of daily food, of what they actually ate day in and day out, season after season, is simultaneously the most forgotten and the most ingenious of all. The poor of medieval Europe did not just survive at the table. They created something there, something that became centuries later the foundation of some of the most beloved cooking in the Western world. And it all started with knowing exactly what to do with almost nothing. There is a particular kind of genius that history almost never records. Not the genius of the general who won the battle, not the genius of the philosopher who named the idea, or the architect who designed the cathedral, or the merchant who built the fortune. Not the genius that gets written down in books and remembered in statues and taught in schools. The genius I am talking about is quieter than all of that. It is the genius of the woman standing over a fire on a cold November morning in 13th century France, with a handful of dried beans, a small piece of salted pork fat, some wilting vegetables from the garden, yesterday's bread gone hard as a stone, and the accumulated knowledge of her mother and her grandmother and every woman who stood at that same fire before her, figuring out how to make all of it into something that would feed a family through the day. No recipe book, no kitchen staff, no market cart arriving with fresh ingredients, just knowledge, patience, and a kind of creative intelligence that operated entirely within the constraints of scarcity. This is the chapter of food history I think about most. Not the banquets, not the spice ships, not the royal kitchens. This. To understand the daily eating life of the medieval poor, you first have to understand something about the nature of the historical record and its profound structurally embedded bias. The sources we have for medieval food history are, with very few exceptions, sources produced by and for the wealthy. The great cookbooks, the Forme of Curie, the Viandier of Taillevent, the opera of Bartolomeo Scarpi, were written by professional cooks serving royal and aristocratic households. The household accounts that tell us about ingredient purchases and menu planning were kept by stewards managing the affairs of great estates. The feast descriptions that survive in chronicles were written by people who attended feasts. The ordinary medieval peasant household left almost no written record of what it ate. What we have instead are fragments, passing references in agricultural records, archaeological evidence from excavated settlement sites, animal bones, plant remains the residue of pots, occasional mentions in legal documents when food featured in a dispute, and the careful work of a generation of food historians who've assembled these fragments into something approaching a coherent picture. What that picture shows is not quite what most people expect. The medieval peasant diet was not, as it is sometimes portrayed, simply grey, simply miserable, simply a matter of surviving on gruel and not much else. It was constrained, genuinely often harshly constrained by poverty, by seasonal availability, by the unpredictability of harvests, by the demands of landlords who took a significant portion of what was produced. But within those constraints, and this is the part that I find genuinely moving, there was a food culture of real sophistication, a deep knowledge of ingredients, an understanding of preservation and fermentation and flavour that had been developed and refined over generations, and a set of culinary techniques that turn limitation into something that centuries later the rest of the world would recognise as foundational. Let me give you some specific examples, because specific is where the story becomes real. The medieval peasant household across most of Western Europe kept a pot on the fire or near the fire, or occasionally in the ashes at the edge of it for most of the year. Not a pot that was emptied and washed and started fresh each day. A pot that was maintained, added to, partially consumed, replenished, continuously evolving. This was called in various parts of England and France by various names, but the practice itself was so common that we have a nursery rhyme about it, though most people today have completely forgotten what it originally referred to. Peas porridge, hot, peas porridge, cold peas porridge in the pot 9 days old. That rhyme is not a charming fiction. It is a fairly accurate description of reality. A pot of peas porridge, thick porridge made from dried peas, the workhorse legume of the medieval poor, might genuinely be kept going for days or longer, with new ingredients added as they became available. In lean periods, it might thin down to almost nothing. After a market day, or after a small animal was slaughtered, or after something came in from the garden, it would thicken and enrich again. The continuous pot was not laziness. It was a sophisticated preservation and flavour-building technique that took advantage of the way long, slow cooking develops complexity from simple ingredients. Each addition built on what was already there. The pot had memory in a sense. It accumulated flavour across time in a way that no single-session cooking could replicate. The pot javliche of northern France and Belgium, a jellied terrine of mixed meats preserved in their own cooking liquids, descends from this tradition. The Italian ribollita, the reboiled bread and vegetable soup of Tuscany, that is deliberately made a day ahead and reheated, descends from this tradition. The Scottish cock-a-leekie soup, the French pot-au-feu, the slow-simmered bean dishes of the French southwest, all of them carry the genetic memory of the continuous pot, the medieval peasant technique of building flavour slowly across time from whatever was at hand. What else did the medieval poor eat specifically? Legumes were foundational. Dried peas, dried beans, dried lentils. These were the protein of the poor in the absence of regular access to meat. They were cheap, they stored well through winter, they were filling, and when properly cooked they were genuinely nutritious in ways that medieval people did not understand biochemically, but understood practically through the simple evidence of what kept them working. Onions and garlic. Those same vegetables that the humoral physicians dismissed as fit only for labourers were in fact exactly what the labourers ate in generous quantities. And here is a small historical irony Worth noting the foods that the medical establishment of the Renaissance considered too crude and too heating for refined constitutions were in many ways genuinely health-supporting. Garlic has real antimicrobial properties. Onions contain compounds that support immune function. The peasants eating them were not doing badly. Root vegetables, turnips, parsnips, carrots, beets formed a significant part of the diet, particularly in winter, when nothing else was available from the garden. These were the underground vegetables that sat at the bottom of the medieval social food hierarchy, considered fit for people who, as one Renaissance physician put it, lived close to the earth themselves. What I find quietly subversive about this is that many of these root vegetables are now considered delicacies. The roasted beet salad at a contemporary restaurant, the glazed turnip on a tasting menu, the parsnip soup at a farm-to-table dinner. These foods have completed a full social revolution from the plate of the medieval poor to the considered choice of the contemporary food-conscious diner. The wheel turns. Bread. And we touched on the hierarchy of bread grains back when we discussed the trencher was the single most important food in the medieval peasant diet. Not a side, not a complement. The centre, the foundation, the thing around which everything else was organized. And what made the medieval peasant relationship with bread so interesting was not just what they ate, but how thoroughly they understood the alchemy of fermentation that made bread possible. Leavened bread requires a starter culture, a living community of wild yeasts and bacteria, that when maintained and fed and used properly transforms a mixture of ground grain and water into something that rises, develops flavor, and creates the open, chewy texture we associate with good bread. Medieval peasant bakers did not have commercial yeast packets. What they had was the sourdough starter, a portion of fermented dough kept back from each baking and used to leaven the next. Some of these starters were maintained across generations. Some were passed between households as a kind of shared biological heritage. Some were treated with a care that bordered on reverence, because losing your starter in a hard winter meant losing your ability to make proper bread until you could obtain a new culture from a neighbour. The sourdough revival of the last decade in contemporary baking culture, the careful cultivation of starter cultures, the long slow ferments, the whole grain loaves with their complex slightly sour flavour, is in essence a rediscovery of what medieval peasant bakers did out of necessity every single day. We are paying artisan prices for the bread of the medieval poor. And honestly good. Because they were right about the bread. Fermentation more broadly was one of the great culinary technologies of the medieval poor, and one of the most underappreciated chapters in food history generally. Without refrigeration, without the ability to run to a store when something ran low, the medieval household had to preserve almost everything it could not consume immediately. And the primary tools of preservation were salt smoke drying and fermentation. Fermentation is extraordinary because it does not just prevent spoilage, it transforms. It takes something ordinary and creates something new, something with depth and complexity and nutrition that the original ingredient did not have. The great fermented traditions of European food culture, wine and beer, obviously, but also aged cheese, cured meats, pickled vegetables, fermented fish sauces in Northern Europe that bore a remarkable family resemblance to the ancient Roman garum we discussed earlier. All of these grew out of the practical necessity of making food last. But something interesting happens when you do something out of necessity for long enough. You start to do it for pleasure. The medieval peasant who had no choice but to preserve cabbage in brine discovered that the resulting sauerkraut had a flavour-sharp, complex, satisfying that was genuinely enjoyable independent of its preservative function. The same happened with cured meats, with aged cheeses, with fermented grain beverages. Necessity invented the technique. Pleasure refined it. and centuries later the descendants of those same fermented preparations, the aged parmesan, the prosciutto, the kimchi, have become some of the most coveted, most celebrated, most expensive foods in the world. There is one more aspect of the medieval pour table that I want to bring to you because it touches on something that I think connects all the way back to where we started this entire journey tonight. The social function of food in the peasant community was in certain ways more genuinely communal than anything we have seen at the wealthy tables we have visited. At the great feast, as we have discussed at length, communality was a performance. The seating hierarchy, the differential service, the careful choreography of who sat where and received what, all of it was communality in the service of power, in the service of display. At the peasant table, communality was simply survival. The sharing of food in medieval rural communities was not sentimental, it was structural. Agricultural labour was collective harvesting, planting, maintaining common land, and so was its reward. A household that went into a hard winter without reserves could not survive alone. A family that lost its ox, its primary means of ploughing, faced ruin without a neighbour who would share theirs. Food moved between households in medieval villages with a regularity and a reciprocity that historians of the period have documented carefully. Not just charity, not just the wealthy giving to the poor, which we discussed in the context of alms bread, but lateral sharing between households of roughly equivalent means. A neighbour who had a good harvest shared with a neighbour who had a poor one. A household that slaughtered a pig shared portions with families who had not yet slaughtered theirs. The expectation of reciprocity was understood unspoken and enforced by the social fabric of the community. This was not altruism exactly. It was a community-level insurance system built from food, and it produced a social intimacy around eating, a genuine structural interdependence at the table that the great banquets, for all their spectacle, never quite achieved. Here is something I genuinely want you to think about. We began this entire journey tonight around a fire that was lit approximately 1 million years ago. We noted in that first chapter that the most profound thing fire did for early humans was not the cooking, it was the gathering, the circle, the reason to come together and stay close. And here at the other end of the social spectrum, from the Roman triclinium and the Renaissance banquet hall, in the most modest, most forgotten, most unrecorded corner of food history, we find it again. The same thing. People sharing food because they had to. Because survival required it. Because the fire in the centre of the village was everyone's fire, and the pot at the edge of it fed everyone who needed feeding. Something about that circle, that original circle of shared warmth and shared food, never fully disappeared. It just got hidden sometimes under the tablecloths and the silverware and the hierarchies and the performances. But it was always there, in the continuous pot, in the shared harvest, in the neighbour who came to the door with something from their garden because they knew you were running low. It was always there. We're almost at the end of our journey tonight. Almost, but not quite. Because there is one final question that this entire story has been quietly building toward. A question that is not really about history at all, or rather a question that is about all of history brought right up to the edge of the present moment. We've travelled from the first fire to the Roman couch, to the medieval trencher, to the Renaissance banquet, to the sugar bowl, to the continuous pot of the medieval pour. We have watched the dinner table be a place of survival, of power, of theatre, of medicine, of devotion, of community, of art. We have seen what it looks like when people eat together with genuine intention. And the question that has been forming quietly throughout all of it, the question I want to sit with you in the dark for one last chapter, is this. What are we doing now? What has happened to the dinner table in our own time? And what, if anything, have we lost? And what, perhaps more importantly, is still possible to find again? Something happened in the United States sometime around the 1950s and 1960s that food historians and sociologists have been trying to fully reckon with ever since. It was not dramatic. It did not happen all at once. There was no single moment, no single invention, no single decision that caused it. It was a slow, quiet, almost invisible shift, the kind that only becomes visible when you look back across enough distance to see the whole shape of it. The American family dinner began to disappear. Not completely, not everywhere, not all at once, but gradually, measurably in ways that the data has since confirmed with uncomfortable clarity. In the early 20th century, the shared family meal, a specific time, a specific table, everyone present, was the structural center of domestic life in most American households. It was not optional, it was not aspirational, it was simply what happened at the end of the day, as reliably as the sun going down. By the end of the 20th century, surveys were finding that somewhere between a third and a half of American families ate dinner together fewer than 3 times per week. By 2014, research published by the American College of Gastroenterology found that the average American spent less than 12 minutes eating a main meal. 12 minutes. From the Roman triclinium, where a dinner might unfold across 3 or 4 hours with poetry and music, and the slow, unhurried pleasure of being exactly where you were, to 12 minutes at a kitchen counter, probably standing possibly while reading something on a screen. I'm not saying this to make anyone feel bad about their Tuesday evening. Life is genuinely busy. The pressures on modern families are real and not trivial. But I think it is worth pausing very briefly to notice what happened, and to ask quietly without judgment what we traded away. The research on shared meals is at this point fairly extensive, and it points in a remarkably consistent direction. Families who eat together regularly, even just a few times per week, show measurable differences across a range of outcomes compared to families who rarely do. Children in households with regular shared meals have been found in multiple studies to have better academic performance, lower rates of anxiety and depression, better nutritional habits, and significantly lower rates of certain risky behaviors during adolescence. A research project out of Columbia University's National Center on Addiction and Substance Abuse, which followed the connection between family dinners and adolescent well-being across more than a decade of surveys, found that teenagers who had frequent family dinners were far less likely to engage in substance use than those who rarely did. The family dinner was not just a meal. It was apparently a protective factor. It was, and here is the phrase that keeps appearing in the research, a time for talking. Not structured talking, not formal debriefing, just the ordinary overlapping, sometimes boring, sometimes surprising conversation that happens when people sit in the same place long enough that the silence starts to need filling. That conversation, it turns out, does something that 12 minutes standing over a sink does not. But I want to be careful here, because I think there is a version of this story that is too simple and too nostalgic and not quite honest. The idealized family dinner of mid-20th century America was not for everyone an idyll of warmth and connection. For many women it was an obligation often unacknowledged, often unpaid, often organized entirely around the preferences and schedules of everyone else at the table. The labor of producing a shared meal every evening for decades without recognition or reciprocity was a form of invisible work that second-wave feminism rightly identified and challenged. For many families, the shared table was a site of tension, of hierarchy, of silence that was not peaceful but pressured, of conversations that nobody actually wanted to have, and the industrialization of food, the frozen dinners, the canned goods, the fast food revolution was not only a story of loss, it was also for many working-class families a genuine liberation from the time and labor demands of scratch cooking. For a woman who worked a full shift at a factory and came home to 3 children and an exhausted husband, the ability to put something on the table quickly without extensive preparation was not a degradation of family life. It was a lifeline. So the story is not simple. The story is never simple. The question is not whether to restore some imagined golden age of the family dinner that was never quite as golden as we remember it. The question is something more nuanced than that. What would it mean for us right now in the actual lives we're living to be intentional about the table? Not perfect, not elaborate, not historically accurate or gastronomically impressive, just intentional. I have been thinking about this for a long time, and I keep coming back to a specific idea that threads through everything we have talked about tonight. The dinner table across every culture and every century we have visited was never primarily about the food. We established that at the very beginning around the first fire. The food was the reason to gather, but the gathering was the point, the conversation, the presence, the specific irreplaceable experience of being in the same physical space as another person, not a screen version of them, not a message from them, not the awareness that they exist somewhere and are probably fine but actually physically there. Across a table, sharing something. That experience is not technologically replicable. We've discovered this somewhat to our collective surprise over the last decade or so. Video calls are useful. They maintain connections across distance that would otherwise fade, but they do not produce the same thing as sitting across a table from someone. The shared meal over a screen is not the same as the shared meal in a room. There is something about the physicality of it, the smell of food, the warmth, the small accidents reaching for the same thing at the same time, the spill, the laughter about the spill, the particular quality of silence that is possible only when two people have been in the same room for long enough to relax completely. These are small things, but I think they are among the most important small things there are. Let me bring it back to history one final time because there is a data point from the past that I want to leave you with. In the 1990s, a researcher named Robin Dunbar, an anthropologist at Oxford University, began investigating the social function of laughter. His research eventually expanded into a broader investigation of what he called social bonding behaviors, the specific activities that create and maintain the bonds between human beings. He found that laughter, singing, storytelling, dancing, and eating together all produced measurably similar neurological and social effects. All of them triggered the release of endorphins in ways that strengthened social bonds between participants. All of them were what he called grooming at a distance ways of maintaining the social connections that in our primate ancestors required physical grooming, but that human beings with our larger social groups needed to be able to maintain across more people simultaneously. The shared meal in Dunbar's framework is not a luxury. It is not a cultural nicety or a pleasant tradition with no functional significance. It is a bonding technology, one that human beings developed apparently around the time of that first fire, one that has been refined and elaborated and occasionally buried under politics and hierarchy and theatre, but never replaced, never made obsolete, because nothing has replaced it. Nothing that we have invented in all the centuries since that first circle of firelight has done what a shared meal does in quite the way it does it. We have travelled a long way tonight. We started approximately 1 million years ago beside a fire in Africa, where a creature not quite yet human placed something in the flames and changed the direction of an entire species. We reclined on Roman couches and debated the seating implications of where we lay. We bargained for pepper across 3 continents and built entire empires on the hunger for nutmeg. We watched a young woman arrive in France with a fork and change the architecture of the European table forever. We ate bread that was also a plate and plate that was also a charity. We fasted for 153 days per year and invented almond milk eggs to keep ourselves sane. We prescribed garlic for labourers and pheasant for nobles and wrote diet books that sold across the continent like medieval bestsellers. We watched a man get arrested because his dinner party was too good. We walked into the first restaurants of Song Dynasty China and felt with quiet vertigo how familiar it all was. We followed sugar from a Sanskrit word to a locked box to a plantation to a boycott to the bowl by your stove. We stood at the fire of the medieval poor and recognized in their continuous pot and their shared harvest the oldest thing of all. The circle, the gathering, the fundamental human insistence on not eating alone. And here is what I want to leave you with as you settle into sleep tonight. You have been alive for some number of meals, thousands probably, tens of thousands if you've been fortunate enough to have had access to food with reasonable regularity. And of all those meals, the ones that stay with you, the ones that surface in memory, with any kind of warmth or specificity or feeling, I am willing to make a prediction. They are almost never about the food. They are about who was there, the holiday table with the people who are no longer at it, the friend's kitchen at midnight after something happened that needed talking through, the first meal in a new country surrounded by new people, something unfamiliar on the plate, and the particular loneliness and exhilaration of beginning. The quiet Sunday breakfast that was nothing special and exactly right. The last meal you had with someone before everything changed. The food is the occasion. The people are the memory. And the table, that ancient, stubborn, endlessly reinvented human institution, is the place where we become real to each other. Not through our best selves necessarily, not through our most impressive moments or our most carefully curated presentations, but real, present, hungry, human. Across every century we visited tonight, through every transformation the dinner table has undergone, from the trencher to the triclinium, from the papal kitchen to the Song Dynasty restaurant, from the continuous pot to the Parisian cafe, that one thing has never changed. The table is where we show up for each other. And in a world that makes it increasingly easy to be everywhere else, to be available, connected, informed, entertained, productive, anywhere except exactly where we are, the table asks something quietly radical. It asks you to stay. To be here in this room with these people eating this particular thing on this particular evening. To be for 1 hour not on the way somewhere. To be arrived. So here is a small thing I want to gently suggest, not as a prescription or a lecture, but as an invitation from one person who has spent a long time thinking about all of this, to another who has just listened to it for nearly 2.5 hours. The next time you eat with someone you love, put the phone face down. Not because the phone is the enemy. It is not. But because the person across the table deserves, for the length of a meal, the thing that the Roman host offered his reclining guests, the thing the medieval village shared around its fire, the thing every tradition in every century of food history has recognized as the most fundamental offering one human being can make to another. Your full, unhurried attention. That is the oldest recipe there is, and it has never gone out of season. Thank you. I mean that genuinely and completely. You have been with me tonight across fire and empire and famine and feast, through 1,000 years of bread and a century of sugar and the long quiet miracle of the shared pot. You stayed. You listened. And that means more to me than I know quite how to say. If this story moved something in you, if some chapter of it surprised you, or made you think differently about something you do every day, or made you want to call someone, or sit down with someone, or simply look at the bowl of sugar by your stove with new eyes, I would genuinely love to know. Leave a comment. Tell me which part stayed with you. Tell me about a meal you remember. Tell me about a table you miss. And if you have been watching this and you are not yet part of this community, if this is the first time we have sat together like this, please consider subscribing. Every single video I make is built with the same care and the same love for the stories that history almost forgot to tell us. stories that I believe have something real and warm and necessary to offer us in the present, we are not done either. Because the dinner table story does not end here. There are more chapters, waiting stories of dining traditions from corners of the world we have not yet visited together. Stories of how food shaped wars and ended treaties. Stories of the women whose cooking fed civilizations that never wrote their names down. There is so much more, and I will be here whenever you're ready with the next one. Sleep well tonight. Dream of good tables and warm rooms and people you love, and I will see you next time.